If you live long enough, your life will merge into a series of reminiscences like scenes in a movie. Forgotten recollections will resurface, and you will ache with remembrance. That was my situation as I sat on the porch of my beachfront cottage at Montauk. It was a grey day in early November. The cold wind was blowing off the big water, and the waves beat angrily on the shoreline. A violent storm lurking somewhere over the horizon whipped the ocean's fury into a froth of whitecaps, just as my recent loss roiled my own sense of well-being. My beloved wife was gone, and I was alone in the twilight of my life. I sighed as I lit up my battered pipe. The ancient Zippo had a roaring lion and A-20 insignia of the 312th Bombardment Group. I puffed to make the tobacco in the bowl glow cherry red and thought back over the years. I recalled the thrill of our first kiss, the happiness of our marriage, and the joy each child brought. I hadn't thought about those things when they happened. But 60 years had flown by, and all that remained were the vignettes of my life. Lord knows, I didn't ask to be drafted. Still, the greetings arrived on Thursday, the 18th of November, in the year of our Lord, 1943. A week later, I was standing in a line of scared kids wearing nothing but my underpants. Happy Thanksgiving. The army took a day to poke, prod, and administer the oath. Then they put me on a train to Fort Benning in Georgia. That was the first time I'd ever been on a train. In fact, it was the first time I'd been away from home, overnight. I don't remember much about the ride down. You don't think clearly when you're overwhelmed by fear. I mean, seriously. One day, you're a kid with a comfortable life. Then bam! You're stuffed onto a train full of strangers going God knows where to do God knows what. The situation would stir up anybody's feelings. There were a few boisterous types, idiots who thought this was a great adventure. There wasn't a lot, but they were yucking it up in the front of the car. Most of us sat in stony silence, staring miserably at the passing fields, swathed in our desolation. I wasn't afraid of death. Hell, no kid ever thinks that far ahead. But the loneliness and all-encompassing anxiety about the unknown pressed down on me like a giant hand. I tried to sleep, but the seats were uncomfortable and there was too much movement around me. I heard people talking, but the dominant sound was crying. That included the guy I shared the rock-hard second-class coach seat with. He was a skinny kid like me, but he was a lot shorter. I should have said something to him, but I was afraid, mainly because I was one teardrop short of joining him. I was tall for my age, maybe 6'2" and 170 pounds. I had grown into my gangly frame and was a pretty decent baseball player. But I was just a boy with every child's insecurities and vulnerabilities. Of course, I also had all of the teenage urges. Those manifested themselves in pimples and persistent blue balls. I might have found relief from the latter. But my pastor had stressed the sinfulness of Onan. Hence, I was hesitant to take the problem in hand, so to speak. Later on, that particular fairy tale was one of my chief problems with Lutheranism. I felt lost as I stared at the frozen fields and the passing small towns. I kept telling myself, "You gotta face it like a man, Eric." But I didn't believe a word. I knew whatever was waiting at the end of my miserable ride was going to be worse than what I'd experienced so far, and with that, the tears began to fall. Our gang hung out at the hotspot, which was the town diner. It included Jed Sharp, who was the smartest kid in our school, and his girlfriend Betty Moran, who was the prettiest. There was also Ace McClure, who lived down the block, and his girlfriend Maggie Patterson. Ace was the only fellow who could handle Maggie, if you catch my drift. But then again, Ace was a lot worldlier than the rest of us. I put it all down to the books he read. Ace didn't belong in our backward little town, and Maggie was never going to leave. Nonetheless, they were sweethearts in their own way. Maggie had the biggest jugs I'd seen outside a Wisconsin milking shed, and there were rumours that she wasn't a virgin. That intimidated the shit out of us guys because none of us had the slightest idea what we'd do with Mags if we ever got her alone. Then again, the actual mechanics of whatever Ace and Maggie were up to was a mystery to all of us. It was as if they had some arcane information that the rest of us didn't share. So we made envious jokes and wild speculations about what the two of them were doing. Me and Bobby Dooley and Bill Weinstein and Heinrich Dorf were the other guys in our group. We were so far from understanding the nuances of sex that we must have sounded like idiots acting oh so sophisticated. There were girls in the group too. Madge Blunt, Gilly Springsteen, Greta Thornberry and Patsy O'Toole. They were just as clueless as we were. Jed had a car. So, he and Ace would double date to the movies in Eau Claire on sultry summer nights. The theatre over there had something called air conditioning. The rest of us would go down to the lake. We would build a fire, sit around and talk. Patsy O'Toole seemed to have a thing for me. Patsy always followed me around, and she would sit next to me while we discussed the travails of life in a world full of crazy adults. That part of Wisconsin was thriving back then. There was a war going on in Europe and we were America's dairy, so we all lived comfortable lives. My old man worked with Ace's dad over at the Grange Hall, and he got me a part-time summer job, tossing feed sacks into piles and moving those big metal milk cans for transshipment. It was starting to put some genuine muscle on my frame. I was thinking that the Grange might be the life for me. It paid good money, and the work was steady. It seemed like the perfect situation after 10 years of depression. That is, if you wanted to settle down and get married. The problem was that rumours of the draft were everywhere, and it's hard to make plans with that dark cloud hanging over your head. Patsy was an Irish girl. The Irish produced some beautiful women. Patsy wasn't one of them. She had the banjo eyes and a long nose that are characteristics of a lot of Hibernians, along with plenty of frizzy red hair and freckles. But she was a sweet girl, very warm-hearted and sympathetic. I might also mention that she had a body rivaling Betty Moran's, not that we had any idea of what to do with it. It was after 10:30 and the rest of the gang had left. Patsy and I were sitting in the flickering flames of the dying fire. That's when she turned to me, blue eyes almost obsidian in the dark, and said nervously, "Would you like to kiss me?" I looked at her tentatively. I was a hopeless mix of shy and naive, which no doubt explains why I had never had an actual girlfriend. As a substitute, I was every girl's best friend. Betty Moran and I hit it off swimmingly because I was too self-conscious to take the first step. We'd hang out at the hotspot, just the two of us. Jed didn't mind. He knew I was too inhibited to make a move on her. Nevertheless, since Betty and I were friends, not potential lovers, she would tell me things Jed didn't know, like how relentlessly Duke Williams hit on her. Duke's old man owned the bank, so the Dukester was entitled with a capital E, pun intended. Duke didn't stand a chance if Jed was on the scene, yet it didn't stop him from chasing after Betty like Caligula on aphrodisiacs. Rather than piquing Betty's interest, Duke's attention grossed her out. She admitted sadly, "You'll know I've hit rock bottom if I ever give in to that guy." It would have been tough bananas for Duke if Jed found out what he was doing. So I kept that information to myself. Jed was nobody to mess with, and he loved Betty to distraction. On the other hand, Duke always got what he wanted. Eventually. That was something that I thought about when Jed told us he'd signed up for that government flying program. What would happen if Jed ever went away? Now, out of the blue, Patsy had offered herself to me, at least for a kiss. Women were indeed unfathomable creatures. The problem was that due to my self-consciousness and the Lutheran propaganda about sex being evil, I had never made out with a girl. But still, I had enough pent-up steam in my boiler to power the entire city of Milwaukee. So, I wasn't going to turn down any offers. Patsy leaned toward me, eyes closed, and I leaned toward her. Our lips touched, and inevitably, the raging teen hormones took over. Patsy made a little sound and threw her arms around my neck. I grabbed her, and the situation abruptly became very serious. Our lips were crammed together, and my heart rate was approaching the red line when Patsy opened her mouth, which led to the novel experience of me having my tongue inside another person. Lordy, lordy. That was a new and stimulating thing. if not slightly unhygienic. Our tongues duelled back and forth for a minute, accompanied by a loud storm of panting. Then, whether the situation overcame her or she just wanted to lay down, Patsy slowly reclined on the blanket. I propped myself on one elbow and moved my hand so that one was behind Patsy's back. I remember thinking, puzzled, what do I do with the other one? Well, one obvious option was Patsy's big right tit. Patsy really had beautiful boobs. I had appreciated them from afar. Now I was squeezing one of those massive bouncers over her t-shirt and bra. That caused Patsy to produce a loud moan, which I understood as permission to proceed. Patsy was panting and moaning, and I was industriously exploring her bountiful chest. With all the rolling around, her t-shirt eventually worked its way up over her cheap cotton bra, revealing two splendid peaks. All I could think was, what a pair. Moses, standing atop Mount Nebo, must have had the same sensation. So, fuck Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. The mating imperative was driving the bus. I shifted my hand from outside Patsy's bra to inside and grabbed an immense bundle of naked pleasure. It had a red-hot, rock-hard centre that was rapidly becoming stiffer and stiffer. I don't know about Patsy, but that was the point where whatever passed for rationality went out the window. I instinctively began to move on top, or her. She moaned with approval. Then she made a mysterious grunt and gasp and commenced to thrash around. It was such strange behaviour that I paused, puzzled. The moment she stopped writhing, Patsy shot to a sitting position, tossing me on my back as she did it. She said, anger-shed, "What have we done?" As far as I was concerned, the answer was nothing. Unless you counted putting my nuts in a vice, which was nothing to write home about. But Patsy was an Irish Catholic who clearly saw herself getting tied to a stake for the sin of being human. She hastily pulled her t-shirt down and stood up. Then she said in a strained voice, "I gotta go." "Thank you, Eric." And she disappeared, rushing up the path toward town. I just sat there staring at the lake, trying to get my jumbled wits back together. The ending was unsatisfactory. The spasm Patsy had had was inexplicable. The experience was addictive. That night set Patsy and me on the path to a quasi-boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, which matured both of us, somewhat. Neither of us were anything but ordinary. But I was big and getting much more muscular, and Patsy still had a body to die for. So, we'd hang out around town, and there were a lot more of those sessions, ones like we had had that hot July night. We never went much further than the first time. Patsy'd made some accommodation with the saints of the Catholic Church. But second base was where it stopped. I was finally allowed between her skinny legs, which was where I was headed the first time. Fully clothed, of course. We'd dry hump and she'd have those little convulsions. Now, however, once the wriggling stopped, Patsy kept going. So our sessions sometimes lasted hours. I was allowed to play with her fabulous boobs as much as I wanted, but I wasn't permitted to touch anything further south. Patsy, in turn, seemed downright eager to stoke me until I blew, like Old Faithful. I wondered if she enjoyed herself as much as she seemed to. Women were still a mystery to me. Nonetheless, the trivial sexual experiences we'd had were the gateway to a genuine adult relationship, and my face was starting to clear up. Patsy and I shared something intense and personal, something that was only between the two of us. It built a bridge that brought us gradually closer together, which made me wonder how many of the husbands in that town married the first female willing to fuck them. Patsy was a sweet and unassuming girl, the sort of woman that America was built on. Patsy was good-natured and generous, while at the same time she could be demanding during our special moments. She was also very smart. She was training to be a teller at Duke's dad's bank, and she worked hard. But to Patsy, the bank job was only a bridge to the time when she could start popping out little Irishmen. All in all, Patsy and I were the classic small-town couple, folks who would live and die in obscurity, contributing nothing more to humankind than the next generation. That suited us just fine. We had no desire to be important. to be famous. We were happy living within the confines of our little Wisconsin town, knowing that our names would fade with the passage of time. The draft was the only cloud on our horizon. People like to think that they're in control of their lives. Then, something comes along to remind them that they exist at the whim of forces and events much greater than themselves. Because if you got the letter, you had to drop everything and report to an induction centre. The draft had been around for a year, and we'd never heard of anybody who'd actually been drafted. So it was just one of those vague fears that pop up in the middle of the night to worry a fella. Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of my senior year, and the government started drafting everybody. All the boys in town lived day to day anticipating the bad news. I would go down to the mailbox with my heart in my throat and reach in, as if there was a diamondback rattler coiled in there. It wasn't that we weren't patriotic, but there's a big disconnect between the boyish ideal of patriotism and the reality of putting your life on hold while you're dragged off into an utterly alien world. Everybody in our town professed a love of America. We all stood for the Pledge of Allegiance or when they played the Star-Spangled Banner. But going into harm's way to defend it was a burden that only affected people my age. By 1942, the minimum draft age was 18, meaning they were drafting kids. Patsy made all the difference. She told me she had no idea what she would do if I were drafted. We were planning to get married. It was just a matter of putting this service commitment behind me. Knowing I had a future with a person who actually cared about my sad fate made it bearable. Duke's old man knew the score and he was an important guy. So, he immediately got his little boy a 4F. Flat feet are a terrible and debilitating condition. Me? My old man worked at the Grange, so I was out of luck. I wish I could tell you that I gladly accepted my fate, but it was really just a matter of being out of options. Having to face things you can't avoid is a sobering experience. It might have been my first step toward adulthood, but I was scared shitless rattling along on that cold, rainy November night, heading toward an unknown destiny. We arrived at Fort Benning in a bright Georgia morning. Even the gung-ho types were exhausted. The army had managed draftees off and on since the Civil War, so of course they had a plan. The idea was to keep us constantly in motion. We were hustled off the train and formed up into loose rows, standing there in frightened silence. Then a monster in a round hat strutted up to my group. He was my height, but 50 pounds of rock-hard muscle heavier. His face was like the side of a mountain. He stood ramrod straight, eyeing us with contempt. I stared back at him in horror, and he caught me gawking instead of eyes front. He strolled over, positioned his face 3 inches from mine, and said in a voice that could have been heard 2 towns over, "Why are you staring at me, boy? Do you have homosexual tendencies?" I gulped and stuttered, No. He yelled, spit flying, "That's no, sir." I said, trying to sound keen, "No, sir, sir." He said scornfully, "Drop and give me 20, and I want the rest of you to understand that you will call me sir or sergeant when I talk to you." I did my 20 push-ups with his boot resting heavily on my shoulder blades. All the work at the Grange had paid off. After that first painful lesson in military discipline, the good sergeant went on to outline our circumstances. We were government property now. Uncle Sam owned us, and we would do anything that he, or his surrogate in a round hat, said. We would do it immediately and without question, or we would hate the next thing that happened. The army separates you from your previous life by tearing you down to the studs and rebuilding you in their image. As an incentive, they appeal to your sense of personal pride and esprit de corps. But they spur you on by kicking your ass. The whole idea is to present you with a progressive set of physical and mental challenges. Overcoming those challenges makes you into a man. By the end of recruit training, I was 10 pounds heavier, much stronger, and more self-confident. Plus, I had a new set of disciplined habits. Sounds like a warrior, right? The problem was, the army had failed to check my vision in their haste to kidnap me out of my old life. And sadly, good eyesight is a prerequisite for hitting the broadside of a barn. Since I was virtually lethal to anybody standing on or near the firing range, The army had to come up with an alternative. Of course, it would be silly to think they would send me back to my happy small-town life with an apology. Instead, the army repurposed me. The owner of our town garage had always told me that I was the best mechanic he'd ever seen. His regular assistant was Clifton Blaylock, who was a couple of bricks short of a load. So I never took that as much of a compliment. Nevertheless, I scored off the end of the chart for technical aptitude on the Army General Classification Test, which was news to me. Once the Army discovered that I could spin a wrench, they changed my MOS from self-propelled bullet stopper to general purpose, all-around grease monkey, and shipped me off to Keesler Air Base in Mississippi to be trained to service airplanes. And that was how I became a member of the Army Air Corps. I wasn't a hero pilot like Jed Sharp, but for every Jed Sharp there are 4 or 5 mechanics in the background keeping him flying, and that was where I came into the picture. It was back-breaking work, totally lacking in glamour, but it was important to the war effort, and it was my humble contribution. My parents and Patsy were proud. I wrote to Patsy every chance I got, and she always replied in her childish cursive. It was humble news from home, but it kept me going. Military routine had become bearable once I got used to it. But I still longed for my small-town life and my girl back home. Patsy had become very important to me. Then, in the early summer of '44, one of Patsy's letters gave me the bad news that Betty and Duke had gotten together. I had 2 thoughts. One was that Betty wasn't as strong as she had hoped, because she'd settled. Worse, I was sure that Betty knew it, and she also probably knew that she would live to regret it. I hoped that the bad news didn't take Jed's eye off the ball. Pulling the rug out from under a soldier in a war zone is a terrible betrayal. My second thought was that I was lucky to have Patsy. Patsy was staunch and loyal. She made me feel loved. I'd learned that life is hard and cruel, but it was a lot easier with Patsy in my corner. I got my duty assignment around the same time that the news about Duke and Betty broke. I was going to be a replacement mechanic in the 312th Bomb Group, which was operating on the north coast of New Guinea. I had no idea where New Guinea was, but I was pretty sure that it was a long way from Wisconsin. The trip was an all-expense-paid cruise on the good ship Lull Line, which was a classic instance of a slow boat to China. It was miserable. Me and 4,000 of my closest friends were crammed into racks high enough that you had to climb a ladder to get to the top bunk. It was sweltering in those holds, and monotony wrestled with tropical disease to see what could make us more depressed. The ship spent 2 months meandering from San Francisco to Noumea, then Milne Bay, Oro Bay, and eventually Hollandia. That was where I got off. The Lurline had been disgorging whole units of replacement draftees along the route, so there were a lot fewer passengers by that time it arrived in New Guinea. The trip was incredibly boring. I wrote letters to Patsy, which I knew wouldn't be mailed until we reached a port. I read aircraft maintenance manuals. That gives you some idea how much shipboard entertainment there was. Still, there was plenty of daily physical training on the deck. You should try jumping jacks on a ship pitching through Pacific rollers. The sun was incredibly hot, but we didn't run into foul weather until we reached New Caledonia. Then we were treated to a tropical typhoon. I was berthed in the forward hold with a couple of thousand fellow sufferers. All you could do was lie in your bunk and pray that you wouldn't vomit. A lot of guys did, so the smell was indescribable, even after the storm died down and we went to work with the mops. You live in the moment when you're in a situation like that. It's the only way you can survive without going totally nuts. I suppose that most of the old gang back home was somewhere doing the same thing, and I wondered how they were faring. I knew what Jed was up to. The last word from Patsy was that he was flying Marauders down in the Mediterranean theatre. Mags had told Patsy that Ace was a war correspondent and Heinrich Dorf was a sailor, which was a different occupation than the farmer he had been in his previous life. Bobby Dooley was a different story. He was drafted the same time I was and shipped to the Big Red One, where he was almost immediately killed in the bocage of Normandy. Patsy told me that his parents were devastated. He was the only son among 6 daughters. His folks were Irish, you know. So, they had a big family. Now the name wouldn't continue. I stepped off the ship in Hollandia on a sunny day at the end of December 1945. It was a week after Christmas, but the ambient temperature hovered around 88 degrees and the humidity was easily 100%. Sweating was the normal state of affairs in New Guinea. The climate along the New Guinea coast is hot and humid. There's no dry season. The meteorologists call it equatorial, which is fitting since Hollandia is only about 300 miles south of the equator. MacArthur seized the deep water port at Humboldt Bay because it was an excellent staging area for his next hop, which was the Philippines. Mac had run away from that place back in '42. Now, he wanted to go back. It was always hot and wet, and I don't mean that in any fun sort of way. The monsoon season is from May to October, so the annual rainfall is 80 to 160 inches, depending on where you were. If you're mathematically challenged, that's roughly 7 to 13 feet of water falling on your head. It was so fucking ridiculous that I actually got used to the sensation of rainwater running down the crack in my arse. The moment we arrived, we were herded into a deuce and a half and hauled out to the Centenary Airfield, which was the largest American airbase in the Hollandia area. The 41st Division had liberated it from the Japs earlier that year, and we were the new occupants. I was bunked in with the other mechanics, in platoon-size Quonsets. Centenary was a big complex with 2 long runways and 51 bomber revetments, all connected by taxiways. The burned-out hulks of Bettys and Helens had been dragged out of the revetments and left to rot, and there were a lot of patched-up craters in the runways. But the Seabees had worked their magic, and the 312th had already begun operations, flying patrols and close air support. The 312th flew Douglas A-20s, which was why it was nicknamed the Roaring Twenties. The A-20 was a twin-engine light bomber called the Havoc. It was small by bomber standards, no more than 48 feet, with a wingspan of 61 feet. By comparison, a B-17 was almost twice as long. So, instead of a 10-man crew like the Flying Fortresses, the Havoc only had 2 occupants, a pilot and a rear turret gunner. The Havoc had a top speed of 339 miles per hour, which made it the fastest bomber in the US inventory, faster than a lot of the fighters. In fact, it was even used as a night fighter in some theatres. But a hot rod like that requires a lot of maintenance. It was powered by 2 air-cooled, supercharged Wright twin Cyclone radial engines, each rated at 1,600 horsepower each. My original assignment was the care and feeding of the twin Wrights. I'd changed the oil and spark plugs for all 18 cylinders in breaks between missions. Sometimes we would change out the entire engine. The Havoc packed a knockout punch. There were 6 forward-firing 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the nose, and another 2 50 caliber guns in a rear-facing turret. Those needed a lot of ammo, which I'd help load. The narrow profile made the Havoc fast, but it limited the bomb load. So most of the time the Havoc just carried a couple of 500-pound bombs on hardpoints under each wing. That's because the A-20's forte was skip bombing. Skip bombing was particularly deadly for the Jap troopships and their accompanying destroyers. The A-20 pilots would storm in at 200 feet and release their 500-pounders with a 5-second delay fuse. Those would skip over the water, like a stone plinking over a pond, and then slam into the side of the Jap ship. Meanwhile, the pilot kept the ship's crew occupied by hosing down the target with the 6 Ma Deuces in the nose. Thanks to our Havocs, the Japanese lost thousands of valuable troops trying to reinforce New Guinea. Then, after the Japs gave up on that lost cause, the A-20s made life miserable for the Jap ships trapped in the harbour at Rabaul, across the Bismarck Sea on New Britain. Rabaul was too well defended for us to take by direct assault. So we bypassed it, letting it die on the vine, and moved on up the Bismarck archipelago, while the Air Force amused itself doing skip bombing practice in Rabaul's big harbour. The ships there were sitting ducks. I was given a 3rd stripe and promoted to crew chief about 3 months after I arrived. My crew was responsible for maintaining Captain Bill Bunting's A-20. Bunting was kind of an asshole when it came to his plane. But I wasn't the one facing anti-aircraft fire at 200 feet. So I gave him everything he asked for, including painting some lurid nose art on his aircraft, which he'd nicknamed the D-Cup. I was also the aircraft's armourer, personally threading the whole 9 yards, 27-foot belts of armour-piercing and tracer ammo into each hungry gun. I'd also double-check that the 500-pounders on the hardpoints were properly fused and that the release cables were well greased and ran free. Responsibility for the aircraft was ingrained in me. During the time that I was in New Guinea, I lived mostly in my head. It was a self-defense mechanism that I'd adopted after I was drafted. Living in my own world made me seem aloof to everybody who knew me. But a fella has to do what he has to do to cope. And daydreaming about my girl and my happy home helped me survive in the distinctly alien environment that I was in. These days, sociologists would call me alienated. I didn't think about it that way. All I knew was that I didn't give a shit about anybody or anything. I only paid attention to the stuff I needed to do to ensure that D-Cup was the best maintained A-20 on the flight line, even if I had to spend extra hours working on it, long after the rest of my crew had knocked off. Perfection was the dominant influence in my life. I think I was that way because of the place where I was raised. Back then, rural Wisconsin was full of Germans and Scandinavians, and those folks value orderliness and precision above all things. My attitude fit well with the military mindset, and so, I advanced quickly in the ranks. I never had much interest in drinking and raucous jaunts to the entertainment areas. So, I rarely went off base. Call it arrogant if you like, but I had no intention, or perhaps I was incapable, of being one of the boys. I lived for the rare V-mail from Patsy. My outward detachment might have caused a problem with the rest of the crew, but I simply didn't share their interests or values. Still, I was always fair with my guys, and they never gave me the kind of grief that they usually handed out to loners like me. Sentani wasn't Manila. There were perhaps 10,000 local residents scattered around the whole area, and if you counted the American servicemen, it was closer to 30,000. So the off-base ambiance was more like the spots around Benning and Kiesler, meaning a lot of bars and bar girls. Many were beautiful Asians, just trying to earn a living, if you catch my drift. MacArthur had established his headquarters on a hill above the main air base. He always liked looking down on people. And of course, MacArthur had a staff of thousands. So, a new phenomenon began to appear in the off-base areas. American WACs. The WACs were the women's branch of the army. Most WACs were based stateside, but a courageous few were stationed in places like New Guinea. Those brave women sacrificed their comfortable lives, just like I had, and endured the hardships of service in a shithole like New Guinea. But, unlike me, every one of them had volunteered, not been drafted as I was. WACs did the secretarial and staff support duties of male enlisted men. They were clerks, switchboard and radio operators, even air traffic controllers. Their contribution freed men up for combat duty, 8 divisions worth according to Eisenhower, which had one hell of an impact on the war effort. The old farts in the military hated the sight of women in uniform, and since scandal sells newspapers, the tabloids back home began to circulate the scurrilous rumour that WACs were either dykes or sluts out looking for a good time. And the morals of the WACs became a topic of general discussion back home. That was a disgrace, but that slanderous shit was out there, no matter how noble those women were. It pissed me off. Every WAC I'd ever met was there to do their duty, nothing more. We were all young, horny, and a long way from home. So, of course, there were 20-year-old hijinks, romance, and probably some broken hearts. But those women were no different than the girls in every American small town, and portraying them otherwise was lying and deceitful to the point of being unpatriotic. MacArthur, who always saw things through the lens of what was good for him, called the WACs my best soldiers, which was why he had so many of them serving at General Headquarters Southwest Pacific. And it was the reason so many American women were in that steamy hellhole. There was a particularly popular watering hole just outside the gates where a lot of us enlisted gathered. It had a genuine Wurlitzer jukebox that played Miller, Goodman, and Shaw. So, you could dance. Better yet, The alcohol was plentiful because the Papuans distilled it out behind the building, from 2-year-old bags of rice that the Japs had left behind when they'd skedaddled. The booze at Rosie's had a knockout punch, but that was why we were there, trying to forget where we were and what we'd left behind. That was particularly true for the flight crews. 20-year-old Corporal Jimmy Forbes was the gunner on Bunting's plane, and because I was his crew chief, we would occasionally drag me over to Rosie's. I had been closed off and antisocial since I got my draft notice. Jimmy, on the other hand, had had the opposite reaction. His parents were members of some snake-handling evangelical sect way up in the Appalachians. So all the females Jimmy grew up with were either members of his church or a relative. Most of the time, they were both. Accordingly, Jimmy's lustful teenage urges were chained to the wall by the flinty stares of disapproving family members, all 58. And naturally, that kind of restriction only wound the spring up even tighter in Jimmy's loins. So, when he realised that the females around him weren't potential relatives, he turned into a total man-slut. The drinking establishments in Centani were palm-leaved huts built from the coconut trees surrounding the base. Rosie's was notorious as the joint where both liquor and the bar girls were cheap. So, Jimmy's head was always on a swivel when we visited that place. Probably more so than when he was sitting in his turret looking for Japanese Zeros. We were in Rosie's one night when a group of WACs walked in. WACs wore baggy, rayon and cotton, olive-drab uniforms that could never be described as attractive or flattering. Nonetheless, these were American women, even if their outfits were butt ugly. So 40 males rose from their seats and started circling the girls like a flock of seagulls chasing a fishing boat. The women paused, looking tentative. There were 6 of them altogether. One was tall and rather plain. The second was clearly older. The third was plump and puppy dog cute. The 4th and 5th were the girl next door, but the 6th was an absolute stunner. She was perhaps 5'1" and 100 pounds, with long luxuriant honey blonde hair twisted into a bun and a face like an angel. She had huge eloquent eyes in a perfectly proportioned face, with high cheekbones, a pert nose, and a downright lascivious mouth, which she kept quirked in a knowing, sarcastic smile. A wave of men crashed around the WACs like the monster rollers that break on the Milwaukee Pierhead Light. Jimmy, who had vanished the instant he spotted the WACs, was leading the charge. Me? I just sat there at our table, which was actually 5 small tree stumps arranged around a much wider one. All the tables at Rosie's were that way. The only light was from strings of Edison bulbs wound around the eaves. Nevertheless, even if the lighting was dim, it was bright enough to illuminate a feeding frenzy that a pack of sharks would have been proud to join. Jimmy, who was very good-looking, emerged from the maelstrom leading 2 of the WACs, the older one and the beautiful one. It was clear which woman I was going to get. Jimmy and the beautiful one, whose name was Maggie, were already flirting. The older one and I sat there staring off into space. The awkwardness finally got to be too much. So I turned, stuck out my hand and said, "Eric." She got a look of relief on her face, which I'd noticed was pretty. Lovely eyes, very smooth skin, and dimples. She said, "Laura." And that was how I met Laura Besley. Laura was a staff sergeant 1 rank above me. She was a couple of years past 30, and she supervised the typing pool for one of MacArthur's administrative units at GHQ Sepak. She had nut-brown hair in a page boy and dark, eloquent eyes underneath her bangs. She also had a playful sense of humour, and her figure was trim and neat, not voluptuous, not skinny, just right. Jimmy was working on Maggie, and she was giving it right back to him in spades. It was like watching 2 heavyweight boxers in a title fight. Laura said to me conversationally, "Mags has been around. She knows how to handle your friend." Maggie was like women are nowadays, totally free-spirited and independent. She had been a secretary in Manhattan prior to enlisting, and she was a couple of years older than Jimmy and me, meaning she had been around the barn a few times. She'd never married. She'd told Laura that it was because her exceptional good looks guaranteed that she didn't ever lack for male companionship. I thought about Patsy's and my love life, and I could see that Laura had a point. Whatever was happening was, no doubt, mostly harmless flirtation. I raised my hands in a surrender gesture and said, I wasn't implying anything, really. I was just surprised that there was so much social life here in Centani, because I rarely get out of the hangar. Laura looked at me intently and said, You're a good-looking guy. How come you don't go out? That was when I told her about Patsy and how much I missed her. It took 15 minutes, and it, no doubt, sounded creepy and maudlin, even for a homesick GI. But I'm utterly lacking in social skills. Laura gave me a pitying look and said, Do you actually believe that your girl back home is sitting there, doing nothing but waiting for your letters? Patsy sounds like a normal, healthy female to me. Plus, she isn't getting any younger. At least if she's one of those girls who's only interested in making babies. I said heatedly, Patsy would never betray me. She loves me. Laura actually reached over and patted my hand as she said, Does she tell you that? I said, Well, no. But Patsy's love shines through in every letter that she sends me. She's working in the bank in our town, and she does volunteer service with the Red Cross rolling bandages. So she doesn't have a lot of time to write. But I know that she's faithful because I've told Patsy that her loyalty is very important to me. Laura looked at me with genuine sympathy and said, Well, I hope that's the way it is then, soldier. Because you're definitely one in a million. Rather than sounding like praise, it came across like she was telling me I had a lot to learn about life. I was just about to tell her that I wasn't some Wisconsin bumpkin, but Jimmy, who had been playing kissy face with Maggie, decided that the time was right to grab her small but shapely right boob. And that triggered a slap of epic proportions. Maggie leapt to her feet and said, I'll tell you when you can touch me, soldier. Until then, you can keep your hands to yourself. With that, she turned to Laura and said, Come on, girlfriend. There are plenty of other guys in this place. And she went stomping over to a table full of appreciative GIs who were more than happy to make room for her. Laura gave me a, See, I told you so, look. Then she rose and walked over to join her friend. I looked at Jimmy, who was rubbing his jaw speculatively, and said, It looks like you struck out, partner, but you were punching way above your weight anyhow. So, leave that hot little thing to the officers, and let's get our ass back to base. We've got a mission tomorrow. Jimmy glanced speculatively in Maggie's direction, still rubbing his jaw. Then he rose without a word, and we walked back to the barracks together. The next morning was the very last time I ever saw Jimmy. He and Bunting bit it skip bombing a few stray Jap ships in Coker's harbour. I wondered if Jimmy woke up that morning thinking, Today's the day I die. D-Cup went straight into the water trailing smoke, and Jimmy's and Bunting's lives ended just like that. It was a superbly pointless death, but such is the cruelty and capriciousness of war. As for me, Jimmy's death hammered home the reality of what we were doing. If you're a mechanic, you put in long, sweaty hours keeping a complex machine in tip-top shape. It's dirty, menial, and often unpleasant work. But real death is an abstract concept to people like me. That wasn't the case with the guys flying the A-20s. The practical outcome of Jimmy's loss was that I didn't have a plane to crew anymore. But the situation didn't last more than 3 hours. That's when I got orders to report to the headquarters of the 39th Troop Carrier Squadron. Colonel Prosson, who was head of maintenance for the entire Far East Air Service Command, had requested me as a crew chief for his personal C-47. I guess hard work pays off. I just carried my footlocker across the runways to the 39th Barracks, which was in a bigger Quonset. By that stage in the war, the US had progressed up the island chain all the way to Okinawa anyhow. So, the 312th was in the process of upping stakes and moving their A-20s to the Philippines. Most of the remaining aviation was strictly supply-oriented. Naval Base Hollandia was the advance headquarters of the United States 7th Fleet. Bulk supplies from the US came through there. Then we'd distribute it out to any place within the C-47's 3,000-mile range, which made the 39th one of the most important units still based at Centani. Prossen's Skytrain was called the Gremlin Special. It had the number 13 along with a cartoon gremlin painted on its nose. I have no idea why people didn't think that presaged bad luck. It featured the usual bench seating for 2 rifle squads, which translated to 24 paratroopers. Sitting side by side, those guys would have a ringside view of whatever hellhole they were being dropped into. The C-47 was a workhorse in all theatres of the war. It was powered by a couple of Pratt & Whitney twin Wasps. They were a lot easier to maintain than the Wrights because they weren't supercharged. And I had a much bigger crew because it was a transport wing. To emphasise my new status, they gave me a bottom stripe. I wrote Patsy about it, just to let her know I was coming up in the world. Patsy was writing less and less as the war dragged on. I understood. It was hard for the folks back home to truly understand what we were going through. And I was sure that Patsy had friends and family all begging for attention. Plus, it takes a lot of time to compose a letter about nothing. My routine was always the same. I rose at 4:30 to go down to the flight line. I'd inspect the enlisted mechanics. Then I'd hand out the day's duty assignments, grab a cup of coffee and sit down to wrestle with the minutiae of maintenance logs, repair schedules and timetables. That usually took the morning. Afternoons were spent working with the crew on whatever maintenance tasks we had on the books. All in all, the job was no different than the daily schedule every working stiff follows. The time passed in a repetitive rut. Then, I got a V-mail on the 8th of May 1945. Most people recall the date because it was the day Germany surrendered. There was a party at Rosie's to celebrate that, but it was muted since we were fighting the Japs, and they showed no sign of giving up. It was also my 22nd birthday. Patsy's last V-mail had been nearly a month and a half earlier, and I was worried that something had happened back home. So, you can imagine my joy when I heard my name at mail call. I grabbed Patsy's letter and retreated to my bunk to devour the news. And that was when my boyhood ended. The letter was short and not sweet. It featured the usual excuse. I'd been away for almost 2 years, and at age 22, Patsy felt like the prime years for motherhood were slipping away. Accordingly, she wanted to get on with things. That was all she wrote. I learned from my mum, much later on, that it was due to Patsy being knocked up. Duke Williams was the perpetrator. He'd continued to play around after his marriage, no surprise there. And as vice president of the local bank, he deemed all of its tellers to be his personal sluts. Unfortunately for him, he'd underestimated how fertile Patsy was. Patsy's pregnancy ruined Duke. Everybody in town knew our story. And so, the community at large wanted to lynch the motherfucker. That caused a major public relations problem for the bank. Hence, Duke Sr. had to create plausible deniability, pronto. So, he fired Duke and cut him off financially. And of course, Duke couldn't find a job anywhere else after that. I felt sorry for Betty. Instead of being the wife of a future president of the local bank, Betty was stuck with an unemployable philanderer. But then again, she'd made her choice. She and Duke had kids. So divorce was totally out of the question, at least back in that era. Hence, she and Duke were trapped in a loveless marriage. My only consolation was knowing that Betty would make Duke pay and pay for his transgressions. And the torture would continue, for every day of their no doubt miserable lives together. Duke himself must have spent his time raging at how unfair it was, since he'd done nothing wrong in his own mind. The woman was supposed to take care of birth control. The thought of my Patsy fucking that cowardly douchebag hurt a lot. I knew from experience that she had tons of passion in that amazing body, only constrained by her Catholic upbringing. It gave me fits of jealousy to imagine the ride that she must have given Duke, once he got past the dogma. I wondered how many times the two of them did it before her luck ran out. Patsy was as naive as I was, and so she was an easy mark for an unscrupulous predator like Duke. Plus, Patsy had never experienced mindless lust before, so she must have been totally out of control. Nonetheless, Patsy got the only thing she wanted in the end, which was a child. Maybe she was happy. More pertinently, that knowledge of Patsy's pregnancy was still in the future, so I was bewildered at being so unceremoniously dumped. Why had Patsy given up on me? What had I done? The feeling of utter hopelessness was so overwhelming that I almost ate a bullet. The only thing keeping me from doing that was my greater fear of death. For the next week, I was either in the hangar fucking up my assignments or at Rosie's getting drunk. That's where I ran into Laura, again. I was sitting alone trying to guzzle myself into oblivion when Laura sat down at my empty table and said in her sympathetic voice, "You got the letter, didn't you?" I slurred, like a whiny little bitch. She said she wanted to get on with her life. What does that mean? Breaking down was just so humiliating, especially in front of a worldly woman like Laura. But she patted my hand and said kindly, "I've gotten a few of those myself. You'll cope like the rest of us. Just focus on doing your duty. Life will take care of the small stuff." Laura's eyes told me that she was speaking from the depths of painful experience, and that was when the epiphany hit. The girl back home was a boy's wish, not a man's goal. Being the best person I could be, now and into the future. That I could control. That was my life's purpose. In that respect, then, losing a girlfriend was a trivial thing compared to adhering to bedrock principles like honour and duty. The army had been telling me that from day one, but I was too constrained by my small-town upbringing to hear it. I sat there looking with awe at this wise woman. Then I stood and said humbly, "Thank you." Laura's words had broken me out of my cocoon, and I was going to be a butterfly. Prosson had heard about my fuck-ups. So the next day I found myself standing at rigid attention, while he reamed me a new arsehole. He was chomping on an unlit cigar as he said angrily, "If you weren't such a great mechanic, I'd take away those stripes. But since you are practically indispensable, I'm only going to confine you to quarters for the next month." Then he stood, stretched, and walked around the desk, located his face 1 inch from mine and yelled, "Your love life ain't the army's problem, boy, and you are going to hate yourself if this ever happens again." I stared fixedly at a spot just above the colonel's head and yelled, "Sir, yes, sir." The colonel turned, walked back behind his desk, and plopped himself down. He shuffled some papers while I continued to stand in silence. Then he said conversationally, "Nicholson and I are taking a morale flight up to Shangri-La this afternoon, and I need somebody in the back to babysit the passengers. That's going to be you, boy, and you had better not fuck it up." I wasn't sure whether Prosson was punishing me or rewarding me. A couple of years back, when the Japs were still a problem in New Guinea, the army had contemplated building a road across the entire island, right through its dense jungles and mountains. Planners had even dispatched survey flights to find possible routes. One of those found an amazing valley, 150 miles to the southwest of the base. The beauty and isolation of the place fascinated every American who flew over it, so much so that it was nicknamed Shangri-La, which was taken from a popular Ronald Colman, Jane Wyman film called Lost Horizons. It was the same kind of mystical place. Photographic reconnaissance revealed that there were natives living there in thatched roof huts and cultivating crops. Those people had a Stone Age existence and they had never encountered a white person. It was also rumoured that they were cannibals. So, although everybody wanted to see Shangri-La, they didn't want to actually visit it. Hence, Prosson arranged for sightseeing flights to see Shangri-La from the air. They called them navigational exercises. Everybody knew they were junkets meant to boost our morale and relieve the underlying boredom. Only a lucky few got on those flights, mostly officers. But it was Mother's Day that Sunday, so there were 8 WACs on this particular excursion. There were also 5 crew: Prosson, nominally the pilot, Major Nicholson, who was the co-pilot and actually flying the plane, Norris and Newcomer, the engineer and radio man, and me. My job was to make sure the passengers behaved themselves. It was sort of an airline stewardess role, which is why I think Prosson assigned it to me. I still had a lot of making up to do. I was there to calm the nerves of anybody who was anxious about flying and to ensure that everybody obeyed the rules, including staying seated during the flight. That wasn't as easy as it sounds. I was just a staff sergeant and most of the passengers were either officers or WACs and they were all definitely there to party. A uniform was impractical. So I went back to my quarters to change into a clean pair of mechanics coveralls. I was the C-47's crew chief and above all I was more comfortable in my work outfit. Plus, it gets cold at 11,000 feet. Then I walked out into the hot sun and strolled over to the waiting Gremlin special. The door on a SkyTrain is on the left side, just forward of the tail section. The flight crew had already boarded, and the passengers were lined up ready to inch gingerly up the narrow steps, which deploy when the door was opened. They were all eagerly anticipating seeing Shangri-La. The first step onto the ladder is awkward, and the ladder itself is small and rickety. So, I was there to assist. Most of the men didn't want my help, but the WACs all let me give them a hand. The first face I ran into was a smiling Maggie Hastings. She was glowing with excitement. Laura was next in line. I said a sincere, "Thank you," as I helped her up the ladder. Laura knew what that meant, and she nodded back meaningfully. I had seen most of the other 6 WACs before, including the tall one and the plump one. I boarded last, pulled up the stairs and closed the door. There is a little canvas fold-down seat located in the tail of the plane. The jumpmaster sits back there to avoid snarling the stick of paratroopers who are waiting to exit the plane during a drop. That was the logical place for me to be since I wasn't sightseeing. Surprisingly, Laura and Maggie, who were first to board, were sitting near me, just on the other side of the door. Apparently, they'd rushed to the front and discovered that the wing blocked their view. So, they had hurried back to position themselves at an unobstructed rear window. They both seemed absolutely thrilled to be there. Laura was cheerful and self-contained. Her classic good looks and her kindness had gotten under my skin in a serious way. I thought to myself, she is really a very attractive woman, even though she was perhaps 10 years older than me. In fact, I was thinking about asking her to one of those legendary blanket parties when we got back. Maggie was incandescent. She had her gorgeous face and trim little figure, but it was her aura of energy and frank sexuality that made her stand out. Sitting apart from the passengers, I could see that every guy was either flirting with her or eyeing her like a prime cut of beef. I wondered if any of them would get lucky. One thing that I knew for sure was that Maggie was way out of this boy's league. I might be a staff sergeant like Laura, but the comparison ended there. Laura and Maggie were both very worldly and sophisticated, while I was purely small-town America, honest, hard-working and naive. The slick-looking major with the Clark Gable moustache sitting across from Maggie was more her type. The C-47 is not built for comfort. With all of the noise and vibration, it's kinda like being inside a cement mixer. But the distracting sounds did nothing to dampen the festive atmosphere among the passengers. Maggie's major produced a flask and handed it across the aisle to her. She laughed and took a swig. Then she handed it to Laura. I was back there to prevent that sort of stuff. But what the heck? They were enjoying themselves and not causing any trouble. And they were about to see something very few people had ever seen. So, they were giddy with excitement. Instead, I sat there thinking about my current situation. I was single. Actually, I had always been single, except in my own mind. And I was as horny as any guy could be after almost 2 years of living strictly with other men. I stole a surreptitious glance at Laura, who was chatting amiably with the lieutenant next to her, and thought, Laura's gone out of her way to be nice to me, and she's a lot smarter and prettier than Patsy. Maybe she's my next stop. Maggie's shriek of laughter interrupted my reverie. Laura's friend might be something special in the looks department, but she was an irritating little shit. The Baliem Valley, or Shangri-La as we called it, is a 50-mile long and 12-mile wide river basin that sits 2 miles above sea level, directly between the highest peaks on New Guinea. The flight to it normally takes under an hour. So, when nothing had happened after an hour and a half, I walked through the partying passengers and up to the cockpit. I asked Nicholson if there was something wrong. George Nicholson was a good pilot and a good guy. He always treated enlisted like me with respect, and we respected him. He said offhandedly, "We're over the valley right now, but we've got cloud cover. I was circling to find a hole, but it's socked in." Prosson said dryly, "That valley is huge, and I don't want to disappoint the passengers, so we're going to dive through the clouds. Just tell the people in the back that there will be a period when there'll be nothing but cotton outside their window." I said, "Aye, aye, skipper." I walked back and announced that there would be a short time when we would be flying blind, but that we'd be under the clouds after that, and they'd see the sight of their lives. The passengers pressed eagerly against the windows. Their enthusiasm gave me an idea. When we got under the clouds, I would slide back the aircraft door. It would give the people sitting in the back an unobstructed view of the valley. In preparation, I secured myself with the belt the jumpmaster uses after he opens the door, since obviously the only things that you want falling out of the plane are the things you intend to drop. Suddenly the world went into slow motion. The engines screamed as emergency power was applied, and the plane pitched radically up. There was an all-consuming shock of impact, and I saw stars as the restraining belt pounded me in the gut. Meanwhile, the passengers flew out of their seats and started bouncing around the cabin like so many rubber balls. I glanced toward the front, and the fuselage walls were crumpling toward me like a giant was squeezing a tube of toothpaste. While my universe was consumed by a hideous, never-ending scream of rending metal. Then the aircraft must have hit a tree, because it wrenched violently sideways, and the tail cone where I was sitting snapped completely off the back of the plane like cracking a whip. Blue sky whirled dizzyingly past. I saw the port wing catapult off into the distant trees, with the engine still running, while the entire tail cone, elevators, rudder and all, spun violently down the hill. My wild ride ended with me hanging upside down, almost completely out of the broken section I was in. The jumpmaster belt had saved my life, but it was jammed now. So I gingerly reached into the side pocket of my coveralls, retrieved my faithful jackknife and cut myself loose, falling flat on my face on the fetid-smelling ground in the process. I was trying to clear my head when the screaming started. Nicholson had managed to point the nose upward in a vain attempt to clear the ridge we'd impacted. Consequently, the Gremlin Special had hit bottom first rather than head-on. It didn't immediately explode, but flames were licking through the cabin. Adrenaline is a wonder drug. It narrows your focus to simple survival. It also blanks out trivial thoughts like, what the fuck just happened? And why am I here? I ran several yards back to the main wreckage, dropped to my hands and knees, and crawled into the relatively undamaged rear of the plane. All I saw were bodies and smoke, lit by the reddish flames that consumed the front of the aircraft. It was like the darkest pit of hell. Nevertheless, a few people had survived. Maggie Hastings was struggling to get out from under the corpse of the Major. She must have shot directly across the aisle into him, like a cannonball. Now she was trapped under his body. The spunky little thing was spitting like an angry cat and loudly complaining that her dream trip to Shangri-La had been ruined. I thought that her over-the-top anger was a product of hysteria. I discovered later on that it was just Maggie's uncompromising approach to life. Maggie finally pried herself from underneath the Major and began to crawl toward the light at the broken-off end of the fuselage, swearing like a truck driver as she passed me. I heard shrieks as I desperately sought Laura. I literally stumbled across her in that smoking inferno, tangled with the plump one whose name was Eleanor. The two had been sitting together on my side of the plane. I had to act quickly. I could smell burning plastic, canvas, hair, and human flesh. So, I awkwardly picked them up, one under each arm, and dragged them out of the burning aircraft. Once I got clear of the wreckage, I placed both the wounded WACs tenderly on the ground. I was turning to go back inside when the wing root auxiliary fuel tank blew. I knew there would be no more survivors. Then, miraculously, Another person appeared from around the front side of the plane. I had no idea how he'd survived, since that part of the aircraft was destroyed in the crash. The only thing I could surmise was that he'd been standing up and the impact shot him directly out the front window. We'd never know, since the guy, whose name was Decker, didn't have any recall of that day. He was walking like a zombie, clearly badly hurt. Both legs and his back were burned, and he had a deep gash on his forehead. He was also holding his right arm like it was broken. He plopped down next to where Maggie and I were helping the two women, and just stared off into space, moaning. Laura and Eleanor were awake now, lying next to each other. Eleanor looked at me with pleading eyes. I offered her a weak smile, trying to hide my horror at her appearance. The fire had burned her entire body, but miraculously it hadn't touched her angelic face. She didn't seem to be in pain, but it was obvious that she wasn't going to last long. Eleanor said bravely, "Let's sing." She was actually trying to raise our spirits. Maggie gave me a grim look and then turned a benevolent smile on the courageous little thing and said, "Not now, just rest." Laura was lying next to Eleanor, weeping uncontrollably. I didn't know why. There were just a few superficial burns, but there must have been serious internal damage. I dropped to my knees, took her hand, and said consolingly, "I'm here, my dear, dear friend, and I am going to do whatever it takes to help you survive." Laura paused a second and gave me an intense glance, one that combined fear and fondness into a single heartbreaking connection. She gently squeezed my hand. Then her eyes slowly closed, and she lapsed back into unconsciousness. I'm a guy and guys don't cry. But it was just so unbearable, and I threw back my head and wailed like a newborn baby calf. I felt no shame. I was honouring a friend, one who didn't deserve what had happened to her. I looked across at Maggie, who was quietly comforting Eleanor, and she gave me a puzzled look. It was like I'd surprised her. Then she gave me a wink of approval and comradeship. That surprised me. My impression of Maggie Hastings was that she was a twit, a woman just out for a good time. The Maggie consoling Eleanor in her final moments was a strong-minded, compassionate and courageous person, trying to give the poor heroic girl whatever comfort she could in the last hours of her life. During the death watch, we sat and talked about home. Neither Laura nor Eleanor could hear us. They were mercifully unconscious, but perhaps our simple reminiscences brought some solace to their tortured souls. Both of them ultimately died, Eleanor first. Then Laura. Laura's death happened while I was holding her hand. She muttered, as if surprised. Frederick took a last intense gasp, and her hand went slack. I had no idea who Frederick was, or what he meant to Laura. But it was a bitter irony. This wonderful, compassionate woman would have led a long and happy life if she hadn't boarded a flight to Shangri-La. It was a harsh lesson in how random and transient life is. It was almost sunup when Laura finally passed away. When that happened, I let out a primal scream of agony that was echoed by a wild cry of sorrow from Maggie. Maggie was sitting next to Eleanor's body, violently sobbing. I would have gone over to comfort her, but I was paralysed by my own grief. Perhaps a half hour ensued, while we just sat there silently processing the loss. Then my practical side kicked in, and I began to take stock. Decker was in a bad way, and Maggie had a few serious burns on her legs. Plus, she seemed to have lost her shoes in the impact. Maggie was fixing that little problem by taking the shoes off of Laura's feet. I looked at her with astonishment, and she said bitterly, "What other choice do I have? We've got to walk out of here, don't we?" She was right, of course. But I had no idea how strong-minded you'd have to be to borrow your dead friend's shoes to do it. That's when I realised that I had underestimated Maggie Hastings. There was no way we were going to leave Laura and Eleanor's bodies out for the jungle scavengers. So, I picked up a handy chunk of aluminum. There was a lot of it lying around after the crash, and started to dig. The shard was a surprisingly useful shovel. I had a 4-foot deep hole excavated within an hour. While I was digging, Maggie had industriously rummaged in the undamaged tail section and brought out some blankets. Working together, we gently wrapped our two friends. Then Maggie and I picked up the bodies and carefully laid both women side by side in the hole. It pained me to throw that first shovel of earth onto them. Once I had filled in their grave, I hammered the aluminum shard into the ground with a rock. Using my jackknife, I scratched on its surface. Here lie two American soldiers, Laura Besley and Eleanor Hanna. They served with dedication and honour, semper fidelis. I didn't think the Marines would mind me using the only Latin phrase I knew, and it was damn appropriate. Maggie stood next to me, hands folded, tears trickling down her face, saying silent words of prayer. Her behaviour since the crash had been totally counter to my initial impression of her. Maggie Hastings was one tough cookie, but she also had a compassionate and tender side. I watched with amazement as Maggie reached under her skirt, pulled down her silk underwear and proceeded to recondition it into a serviceable bandage for Decca's horrible wound. Her lack of false modesty was one more interesting piece of information. Now it was time to think about survival. I was in the best shape, so it was up to me to get us out of there. Maggie could walk, but she had serious burns on her legs. Decca was mobile, but his wound was ghastly. We were miles from civilization at the top of a mountain covered by a primeval jungle. We knew that we'd have to fight our way down to the valley in order for any search planes to see us. That was perhaps 10 miles away, straight downhill through uncharted trees, underbrush, swamps, and snakes. We struggled through that terrifying jungle for the rest of the day, making perhaps 3 miles. Blessedly, the humidity was low and the temperatures were bearable. The only food we had was a box of Charms candy that Maggie had in her pocket. We also had blankets and a totally inexplicable life raft. I thought that the raft might make decent ground cover for sleeping. There were no paths, and we soon discovered that the jungle was full of clinging vines. The vines kept tangling themselves in Maggie's luxuriant hair. Every time that happened, Maggie would swear eloquently at the offending vegetation. We finally reached an open space and dropped to the ground to rest. That was when Maggie turned to me, fire in her glorious hazel eyes, and said, "I've had enough of this shit. I want you to use your pocket knife to cut off all my hair." I goggled at her. Maggie's abundant honey-coloured locks were one of her best features. She said angrily, "Either you do it, or hand me the knife so I can do it." I hesitantly handed her the knife. She seized a long, thick strand of her hair and hacked it off about 3 inches from her skull. I suppose Maggie's lack of vanity could be explained by the fact that she knew she was gorgeous with or without hair. But that clearly wasn't the reason why she had done it. Her long hair was slowing us down. So in Maggie's pragmatic mind, it had to go. A shallow beauty like Betty Moran would never mar her exceptional good looks like that, even for the sake of expediency. But Maggie was a different breed of cat. Her allure lay in her innate strength and courage. It was who she was, not how she looked. Maggie Hastings was the total package. After you knew her for a while, Maggie's physical beauty lapsed into the background. Her real attraction lay in her indomitable spirit. Maggie had the guts to carve her own path, and she wasn't going to let something as trivial as a plane crash defeat her. Those innate qualities like fearlessness and confidence wouldn't fade over time. And I had been helping Decca by letting him cling to my shoulder, using his good arm. I'm 6'2" and Decca was a couple of inches shorter, but he was older and more muscular than I was. So, we bulldozed a path through the tropical vegetation as we walked. Maggie, who was a foot shorter and 70 pounds lighter, limped bravely along in our wake. We eventually stumbled into a large clearing. Both Decca and Maggie looked blown. It was getting scary with the increasing lack of visibility and the noisy birds mocking us from the trees. Even the jungle knew we were in trouble. So I said, "Let's camp here. We've got another day before we reach the valley, and I don't know that we'll find another clearing." Maggie was carrying the blankets, and I was toting the folded-up life raft under my free arm. The fact that Decker was even mobile was his contribution. We spread the raft on the clearing floor, and Maggie laid out the blankets as the light faded. Then we were alone in near-total darkness, with only the bright sky to light the scene. Maggie and I gingerly helped Decker lie down. Because of his head wound, he had to be situated flat on his back, even though he had serious burns there too. Maggie wrapped a blanket around him, and he said plaintively, "Thank you." She said tenderly, "Rest up, soldier. We're going to find help tomorrow." Then she turned to me and said, as if she was giving me an order, "I need somebody to hold me." I looked astounded. "Women." Then she added matter of fact, "But you'd better not try any monkey business if you want to keep your balls." Maggie Hastings was a ferocious little critter. Her attitude toward danger was like one of those quick and insanely brave fighting mongooses that the Sundanese keep to guard against deadly snakes. Small, tough, ferocious, and determined to defeat anything she considered a threat. I laughed out loud. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." It was clear that Maggie wanted some human contact to recharge her batteries. Nonetheless, her need to be held was the first evidence that she actually thought like a woman. In fact, most of the time she reminded me of a guy. We lay together spoon fashion under a sky full of stars. She grabbed my free arm and wrapped it around her tiny self, carefully avoiding putting my hand on her ripe little melons. Then she snuggled her exquisite round butt into me, sighed and said, in her first truly friendly tone, "Good night, cowboy." I mumbled, "I'm from Wisconsin, not Texas." Maggie's voice was drowsy. "Don't you have cows there?" I said, "Of course, we're the dairy state." She said, ipso facto, "Well then, good night, cowboy." "Okay, two can play that game." I said, "Good night, Squirt." Maggie mumbled her approval. It definitely fit. She was so tiny. Sleep came mercifully fast. We were utterly exhausted, emotionally as well as physically. Just as anybody who'd undergone what we had would be. The dawn comes up like thunder in the tropics. Kipling wrote that. I discovered as the sun rose that I was lying on my side holding a superb little tit in one hand, while its owner was softly moaning and moving her firm little bottom around on my raging hard-on. I was luxuriating in the sensation. Then it dawned on me whose tit and arse I was enjoying, and I rolled quickly over. I had no desire to get slapped. I reminded myself that I wasn't on a tropical holiday with the most beautiful woman I had ever known. This was life or death, and the odds were distinctly on the side of the Grim Reaper. I rose creakily to my feet, the result of being thrown around in the crash. Then I looked at Maggie's legs, and there were some really nasty burns. She must have been in agony all day, but I hadn't heard a peep out of her. We were lost in a jungle, 150 miles from civilization and surrounded by Stone Age people who were alleged to be cannibals. I should have been scared shitless, but I really wasn't that worried. Most of my confidence came from my growing faith in my spirited little travelling companion. Maggie was awake now. She woke like a cat, fully aware of her surroundings. And like a cat, she had hazel, almost amber eyes. They were presently focused on me in a speculative glance. It was like she was deciding how far she could trust me. We didn't have food or water, so we didn't need to make breakfast. We just folded the blankets and the raft and continued the painful trek down the mountain. We walked in silence, trying to preserve the last of our energy. The fundamental instinct to survive burned brightly in all of us. But the hunger and thirst had its insidious impact. 4 agonizing miles later, we had arrived on flat land and the jungle had thinned somewhat, so we made better progress. I could see an empty space in the trees ahead, which indicated that we might be getting close. That's when I heard a loud crash behind me. I turned startled. and Maggie was on her hands and knees crawling determinedly behind us. I parked Decker, turned back to Maggie. I said anxiously, "What happened? Are you all right?" She snarled, "Just keep walking, I'll follow." I said, stunned, "What's wrong with you? Why are you crawling?" "Yep." I know that was a stupid question, but I was utterly bewildered. She pulled her WAC uniform skirt up to mid-thigh and said angrily, "Here's why I'm crawling. My damn legs don't work anymore." The burns on Maggie's gorgeous legs had turned into infected sores, and their poison had clearly weakened her to a point where she couldn't stand upright. But no infection was going to defeat Maggie Hastings. She would crawl down it on her hands and knees if she had to. That did it. I said, "Both of you just sit here and rest. I'm going to find out how much further we have to go." And I surged off into the jungle. Maggie's beauty and sex appeal wasn't what was driving me at that point. It was pure desperation. The two of us, Maggie and I, had forged a deep bond of comradeship. We both felt it. But the sores on her legs looked like the beginning of gangrene. So I had to get this gallant woman some help fast. I was sure that the people at Centani would be urgently looking for us once they discovered that we hadn't returned. So we had to get into the open far enough that search aircraft could see us. That was our goal from the beginning. I also knew that they would drop supplies once they had pinpointed us, and I assumed there would be a first aid kit in the package. I thrashed through the vines and underbrush for perhaps 15 minutes, maybe a half-mile total, and then I broke out into a glorious sunlit valley. That auspicious moment marked my arrival in Shangri-La. It was incredibly beautiful. But I couldn't tarry. I needed to get my friends to this place. The two of them were sitting back to back when I returned, seemingly propping each other up. I said to Decker, "Can you walk?" He nodded grimly and hobbled to his feet. Then I turned to Maggie and scooped her up in my arms. It wasn't hard for me to do. Maggie Hastings weighed all of 100 pounds. She began to loudly protest. But we both knew that she was just bitching at me because she didn't want me doing her any favours. The woman had more pride than a Russian Grand Duke. I kept walking, so she finally shut up and grudgingly put one arm around my shoulder to help support herself. Hence, we three motley travellers stumbled the last half-mile through that nightmare jungle and out onto a soft sunny hillock. I laid the life raft out and placed Maggie gently down on it. She said accusingly, "I could have crawled." I just laughed at her. This woman took no prisoners. I could see why Maggie had never had a steady boyfriend, or any form of personal entanglement, romantic or otherwise. Her independent streak kept her from forming any real attachments, even though she was a superbly good-looking woman. She didn't want to depend on any man. I wondered what it was in her personal history that had made her so untrusting. In many respects, Maggie was just like me. I was a loner, a person who was happiest when I wasn't around people and their problems. You can call me arrogant if you like. But I'd survived by putting out the do not disturb sign. It no doubt made me seem aloof. But I was a Wisconsin hick in a bizarre new land, way too self-conscious and introverted to enjoy the boisterous interactions of army life. Maggie's problem was that men are drawn to sexy women like the proverbial flies to honey, and she was a shining example of the species, so she couldn't avoid other people, even if she'd put a barbed wire fence around herself. Her looks alone made her alluring. But she also had that worldly, challenging attitude, like, "You aren't man enough for me." It drove guys nuts. As for me, Maggie's beauty and sexual attractiveness didn't affect me in the slightest, since I knew that she was way out of my league. Every man has a sense of the women they can compete for. It lets them find compatible mates. Of course, there are guys who lack the instinct. It's why nerds ask homecoming queens to the prom. But in general, most guys know their place in the social pecking order. It's the reason why I instinctively knew that Patsy was the girl for me, not beautiful Betty. And of course, dazzling Maggie was miles above Betty on the cosmic look scale. Maggie was an odd blend of sex kitten and hard ass. She appeared to be willing to expertly fuck your brains out or kick your butt. Her sex appeal might have been a happy artifact, but the way she acted, that was who she was. Everything about Maggie was sensual, from her one-in-a-million face to the way she carried her exquisite little body. But underneath all of the sex appeal, the real Maggie Hastings was a rebel and a tomboy. She had the natural swagger and feistiness of a bar fighter, and you got the impression that she wouldn't think twice about getting that beautiful face messed up in a fight. The three of us were standing on the knoll, surveying the sunlit splendour of the Ballium Valley, when we heard the engines of a B-17. We looked up and there it was, gleaming in the sun perhaps 1,000 feet above us. I dragged our bright yellow life raft further down the hill so it would be unmissable from the air, and we waved frantically. The plane waggled its wings to show that it had spotted us. That set off a joyful celebration. We were saved. Then I noticed something odd about the terrain. The ground was covered by sweet potato vines. Perhaps we were standing in the middle of a cultivated field. Even worse, in our haste to become visible, we had forgotten about the local cannibals. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, I heard the yelping of dogs and the buzz of human voices. My blood ran cold. It sounded like a large group of people was coming our way. The noise got closer, and suddenly we were surrounded by dozens of odd-looking little men whose only mode of dress was a penis gourd. These were the Dani. They had lived a Stone Age existence since the dawn of time in that beautiful and temperate valley, and it was rumoured that there were tens of thousands of them. They had tamed fire, but they hadn't discovered the wheel yet. Their numbering system was 1, 2, 3, and many. Their headhunting and cannibalism was real. But fortunately, they only ate each other. To my Western eyes, they were incredibly ugly. They were mostly around Maggie's height or shorter, with oddly shaped, disproportionately large heads, very prominent eyebrow ridges and a lot of hair. Their skin glistened with pig fat and they stank. They stood in a solid phalanx armed with spears, silently eyeing us. The Dani had never seen people with white skin, and they clearly didn't know what to make of us. I was told later that there was a legend among the Dani that spirits with long hair and light eyes would bring about the end of their world. We fit that description, and in reality, that is exactly what came to pass. But that happened 4 decades later. Maggie and Decca scrambled to their feet. I whispered under my breath, "Smile!" Maggie handed me the only food that we had among us, the box of charms. We held our breath while the mob encircled us, jabbering in a language that was mostly clicks, whistles, and odd guttural grunting sounds. Then a guy who was evidently the leader stepped forward. I could tell he was in charge because his penis gourd was a lot bigger than the rest. Nothing changes in the guy world. I was perhaps 1.5 feet taller than he was. I stepped forward gingerly, trying not to loom over him, my arms spread wide in greeting, a huge smile plastered on my face. I said as peaceably as I could, even though my heart was pounding, "We come as friends." He looked confused, like he was shocked that I made sounds. Then he reached out and began to feel the sleeve of my fatigue uniform. He looked puzzled. I learned later that he thought I was covered with mud, since the Dani don't have a concept of clothing. I offered him a charm, popping one in my mouth to show him what to do with it. He took it and did the same thing. His look of astonishment almost made me laugh. Amusement would have been fatal, since the Dani wouldn't have known what the laughter meant, and most of them were armed with wicked-looking throwing spears. I offered my hand, and the leader tentatively took it. Then I pumped it up and down in a sign of greeting. He made a noise of recognition and began to enthusiastically pump back. A black man who had never seen a white man, and a white man who'd never before encountered anybody like the man whose hand he was shaking, understood each other. And that was how the outside world met the Dani. I made a helping gesture and then pointed at my 2 friends. Maggie couldn't stand up any longer, so she was sitting back on the raft. Her long, beautiful legs were exposed and the infected sores were evident. The leader gestured to me. Then he walked over, sat down, picked up Maggie's leg and began blowing on it. Maggie yelped, outraged, but I gave her a "just let him do it" gestura and she relaxed. I later learned that this was a highly personal Dani ceremony, which to them keeps the soul intact in the body. More importantly, it was a sign to the others that we'd been accepted as new residents of Shangri-La. But this Shangri-La wasn't a utopian paradise in the Himalayas. It was an isolated valley surrounded by an inaccessible jungle, as remote from our civilization as Mars. There had been some contact with the Balium Valley in the past. Intrepid adventurers had described a place populated by savage headhunters who, when not making war, raised boars as big as donkeys. That was where we were now. In fact, the Dani were more curious than hostile. We decided that we had to stay where we were, which was several hundred yards from their village. The obvious reason being that that particular place was where the search plane had seen us. It wasn't a bad spot to set up camp. The climate itself was ideal and we had our raft and blankets. The Dani brought us pork and sweet potatoes, which was the first food we'd had, besides a box of charms, in almost 50 hours. Then they went back about their business, cultivating the field around us. We sat silently, just eating, and processing the knowledge that we were still alive. We had been in survival mode the whole time after the crash, which narrows your vision to the moment that you're living in. Now we had the prospect of a future, and it takes time to change your psychic gears. About an hour later, the reality of our rescue was reinforced by the sound of twin wasps as a C-47 swept overhead. I could see the loadmaster in the door as he began to kick out crates that floated down into a field near the river running through the centre of the valley. That was approximately a quarter mile from where we were standing. I waved at him, and he waved back. I was the first person to get to the crates. Mags, who was supposed to be up on the hillock resting, wasn't far behind, and the Dani were all streaming down to see what the magical birds were. Maggie's presence was fortunate because the C-47 was accompanied by 2 P-38 Lightnings, 8 gunned terrors of the sky. The fellows in the Lightnings saw me running to the crates, with Maggie limping along behind me and a mob of curious Dani chasing us. Now, what would you think if you knew that those folks were headhunters? So, our 2 lethal guardians lined up for a firing pass that would have pretty much depopulated that part of the Balium Valley. It was going to be a grisly mistake, based entirely on ignorance. Maggie heard the P-38's engines rev, just like I did, and she reacted like the heroic woman that she was. The tiny little thing zigged to her right and limped frantically over to place herself between the Dani and the oncoming fighters. Then she stood there unwavering, arms crossed, daring the P-38s to pull the trigger. They aborted and swooped over us, point made. It was the bravest act I have ever witnessed. Meanwhile, I was rifling through the crates that they had dropped. The 20th century had arrived in the Stone Age. There were sea rations, sleeping bags, clean olive drab fatigues, an armbruster wall tent, and more importantly, a full medical kit. There was also an FM radio with enough batteries to power it for hours. The Dani and I hauled our newfound wealth back up the hillock to our base camp in the sweet potato field. They were laughing delightedly, like the whole airdrop was a circus arranged for their entertainment. They had no idea what sort of catastrophe one valiant woman had just averted. The first thing I did was bandage Maggie's wounds. There was antiseptic and sulfanilamide powder in the medical kit, which I sprinkled on liberally before I wrapped those perfectly sculpted legs, tipped by bright red toenails. Maggie had been wearing her WAC uniform for the gala trip to Shangri-La, which was why her legs were so badly burned. The new clean fatigue pants provided much better protection. I did the same thing for Decker, antiseptic and sulfur powder. The wrap made him look like a mummy. He had been wearing Maggie's silk unmentionables to staunch the blood that flowed from his grisly wound. Maggie's drawers were soaked in blood, but they had probably saved his life. The gash was down to the bone. Decker's burns were as serious as Maggie's, but they were less infected because they weren't exposed like Maggie's had been. I applied a liberal sprinkling of the sulfur and wrapped what I could. The most concerning thing was Decker's broken arm. I didn't try to set the bone, but I put a field splint on it and he told me that the splint relieved the pain a lot. He also changed into clean new fatigues. It took me a long time to set up the tent and, for God's sake, I'm a master mechanic. I couldn't have done it without Maggie's help. I laid out the tent materials, assembled the frame and installed 1 foot pole. Then Maggie and I draped the tent cover over the frame, and I installed the remaining foot pole. Finally, we had a roof over our head for the first time since the crash. I spread our raft inside the tent as extra ground cover along with the sleeping bags. We had just had a meal of sweet potatoes and pork thanks to the Danny. But the D rations had chocolate bars along with a pack of Old Gold cigarettes. Could life get any better? I didn't smoke, but Maggie and Decca did, and they treated the cigarettes like a godsend. Apparently those things are addictive. I ate a chocolate bar. It was a nostalgic reminder of home. Maggie told us that the bars were produced by the Hershey Corporation, which was near where she was born. The sun was setting, and Decca went into the tent to sleep. He was gravely injured, and he needed the rest. Maggie and I sat together while she had a final cigarette. We were savouring the situation. We had new clean clothes, a tent and sleeping bags, along with the medication to treat Maggie's and Decca's burns. We even had a little Coleman lantern to see by. We were going to make it. The two of us exchanged companionable glances. I said conversationally, "I misjudged you, and I'm sorry." "Of course," Maggie snapped. "You'd better explain yourself, Buster Brown." I laughed and said, "All the time that I've known you, I thought that you were a dubiously moral and totally brainless party girl. Now that I've gotten to know you, the real you, I can see the tough, self-possessed and genuinely caring person underneath all that camouflage. You've been a perfect comrade in arms, Maggie Hastings." Maggie reacted like I'd insulted her. So I laughed and added, "And you're feisty too, Squirt." She shrugged and said self-deprecatingly, "You'd be the way I am if you've lived the life I've led." Then she got a serious look on her face and said, "Well then, I guess I have a confession to make too." I said fondly, "And what's that, my spirited little friend?" She gave me an odd look and said, "Did you know that Laura was sweet on you?" Then she laughed like that was a stupid thing to say and added bitterly, "Of course you wouldn't, because you don't care about anybody but yourself." That hurt. I thought we were friends. I sat there gawping at her. She continued with, "I told Laura that you were an arrogant arsehole, somebody who liked to sit in judgment, as if you were above us. But she wouldn't listen. She said that you were just shy." I was astonished. I had no idea Laura was that insightful. Maggie said warily, "I told her that a guy who has 4 stripes and who looks like you couldn't be that innocent. By the way, just how old are you anyhow?" I said, trying not to sound offended. 22 as of May 8th. She said, "Okay, you're only a couple of years younger than I am. I wouldn't have guessed it. I mean, I was dumb like that when I was 14, not 22. That pissed me off. I said angrily, "I'm a Wisconsin farm boy. I'd never been anyplace except my little town until the draft yanked me out of my happy life and sent me to this shithole." Then, I teared up a bit, which was embarrassing in front of an aggressive little bitch like Maggie, and added, "I lost my girl back home because I'm here. She was the only thing I cared about. And yes, I know I'm naive." Maggie took a big drag on her cigarette, surprised. She looked at me evaluating and said, "You mean to tell me that you're the kind of hard-working, church-going cliché that every girl in the world is looking for?" I said, "I guess so, whatever that means." Maggie thought for a second. Then she mused under her breath, like it meant something to her. "I don't think I'm looking for that kind of guy." Then she brightened and said, "I bet you're even a virgin." I said proudly, "Of course I am." Maggie looked speechless. I added, "Patsy and I were saving ourselves for our wedding night." Maggie laughed uproariously and said, "Unbelievable." Laura told me about that, but I didn't believe her. "So tell me about this girl back home." I said, "There's nothing to tell you about. Patsy was always my girl. We were going to get married, but she sent me a Dear John letter. I really don't know why. Losing her knocked me for a loop. I thought she loved me. I added bitterly. It was Laura who dusted me off and put me back on my feet. I'll be forever grateful to her. By the way, who's Frederick? Maggie looked astounded. She said, he was the love of Laura's life. He was killed on the Arizona at Pearl Harbor, and that's why she joined the WACs. How the hell do you know who Frederick is? I said sadly. Frederick was her last word. Maybe there is another side. Maggie's eyes filled with tears as she said with regret, I hope they found each other. I said shyly, I was sweet on Laura too. I was even working up the courage to ask her to one of your legendary blanket parties. Maggie laughed fondly and said, you would have to do a lot more growing up before you qualified for one of those, but Laura might have taught you. I said with tears in my voice, I'll miss her kinness. Maggie said quietly, me too. That was it. We'd cemented the bond. We were friends. We sat companionably for a few more minutes while Maggie finished her smoke, and then we retreated back into the tent for the first good night's rest that I'd had since the day I got the letter. The next 10 days were so unlikely that I still can't believe that they happened. Maggie, Decker and I were stranded in paradise, living next to a tribe of Stone Age savages who interacted with us like nosy neighbours. We communicated with gestures. But I got the impression that their language was so limited that the Dani were used to waving and pointing. Whatever the case, we definitely connected. The people at Hollandia made almost daily airdrops of food and essentials. They also dropped a case of Pabst Blue Ribbon. Maggie and I went through that crate like locusts on the Kansas prairie. Even Decker, who was still not well, appreciated the manna from heaven. So, we kept ordering more. The radio let us communicate with the planes overhead. Hence, we were able to listen to the funeral rites conducted above the crash site. The chaplain on board said a few words, and they dropped 20 wooden crosses, plus 1 Star of David to mark the grave of the victims. Both Maggie and I shed a tear during the ceremony. I was gratified that Laura and Eleanor were memorialised. Maggie did all of the communication with the flight crews overhead. She was an ATC radio operator at Hollandia, so she knew the jargon. The sound of Maggie's firm, clear voice coming in over the radio was the outside world's first introduction to her. Maggie was a special person. The Dani had the undeserved reputation of being headhunters and cannibals. So any woman I've ever known would have rightly been hiding in our tent. Not Maggie. She would regularly wander over to their village to exchange the Stone Age version of gossip and tea. The Dani women made a fuss over Maggie. Everyone was about 4 feet tall, and their only fashion attire was a belt of palm fronds around their waist and pig fat, which they smeared liberally on their naked bodies. They couldn't stop touching and chattering about Maggie's clothes and hair, all of it in the Dani's language. Maggie endured it with humour, which was odd given her do not touch policy. Once Hollandia had dropped some ivory soap, Maggie would bathe in the lovely river pool at the foot of the village. Of course, when she waded out for a wash, it was natural for her to leave her fatigues on the shore. The climate was temperate, and the Dani culture had no concept of Western modesty. I would always hang around while Maggie was with the Dani. The Dani were friendly, but they were still an unknown entity, and I wanted to make sure that Maggie was safe. I think she appreciated my presence because she kept throwing me cordial glances instead of her usual back off stare. Of course, that also meant that I was in the neighbourhood when she went for her bath. Maggie would slowly and sexily undress. I had only seen her in her ugly WAC uniform, which isn't flattering, so I would have never guessed that such a voluptuous little doll was lurking beneath that horrible clothing. Maggie's body was exquisite. She was a tiny woman, very slim. Her boobs weren't huge, but they were full and broad and placed high on her chest, with little pink nipples. Her waist was no more than 20 inches. It flared out to tight, muscular hips that were fertile and womanly. When you factored in her marvellous round butt, Maggie Hastings was a goddess. And let me stop you right there. I know what you're thinking. and I can assure you that there was no sexual tension between Maggie and me, or for that matter Maggie and Decker. We were castaways who relied on each other for survival. That cooperation generated mutual respect, not lust. So, any of my comments about Maggie's body were just that, observations. Maggie in her swimming hole looked like one of those water nymphs from the old Greek mythology book that my grandma used to read to me. The squirt would splash around for hours, reveling in the cool water. Meanwhile, a few of the local boys would sit on the high bank of the river and toss small rocks in her direction, which caused me some concern. I would have intervened more forcefully, but they didn't seem to be trying to hit her, and they were just teenagers. Later, I was told that it was a Danny male's way of expressing sexual interest, like the wolf whistles guys do when a beautiful woman walks past. As a way of distracting the boys, I sauntered over and said, "Do you fellows want to learn how to play baseball?" 2 of them promptly took off, but the third cocked his head and said, "Beesball," and added a couple of clicks at the end. I laughed and said, "Watch this." I picked up a likely piece of driftwood and one of his little rocks, tossed it up and swatted it out into the river. He made a series of whistling and clicking noises that sounded like the Danny equivalent of "holy shit." I gestured, "You try it." He took the little driftwood log, tossed another rock, and nearly swung himself off the bluff and into the river. I said, "No," took the little log back, and carefully and deliberately showed him each step of the toss and swing. The kid was intently watching every move I made. The boy might have been alien looking to my Western eyes, but he was really a very intelligent little fellow. I handed the makeshift bat back to him. He picked up a stone and swatted it into the upper deck. His face split into the widest grin. The look of joy was like every other kid who had mastered a new trick. I said, "Baseball." He repeated with a look of adoration in his eyes, "Beesball." When I left, he was swatting rocks into the river, rather than chucking them at Maggie. The next day's airdrop had a ball, a couple of gloves and a Louisville Slugger in it. I sauntered into the village looking for my little friend. He was with his buddy digging up grubs. Apparently it was lunchtime. As soon as he saw me approach, he started shouting, "Bees blow." I motioned for him and his pal to join me in the meadow by the river, and they trooped along with me. The glove was a new concept. I put it on and motioned for him to throw the ball to me. He tossed it like he had done when he was throwing a rock at Maggie. I caught it in the glove and tossed it back to him. Of course, he missed it. I gestured for him to throw it to me again, and he did. I caught it, but this time I walked over and showed him how to put on the glove. I stood back and tossed the ball to him. He snatched it out of the air with the glove. His friend made a whistling and clicking noise that must have been applause. I gestured for his buddy to come over and showed him how to put on the other glove. Then I tossed the ball back to my little friend. I made a gesture for him to throw it to his pal, not me. He tossed the ball, and his friend caught it in the glove. I spent the afternoon hitting balls for them to chase and catch. Then I let my first little pal do the hitting while I helped field. Their delighted laughter was like any other kids playing with a new toy. There was probably never going to be a Ballium Valley Cannibals baseball team, but Shangri-La had a new pastime. The upshot was that I had a devoted best friend. I called him Spanky, like the kid from our gang. The little guy hung around me constantly. I even remember waking one night with something really smelly in the tent. I turned on the Coleman to discover my little pal sleeping contentedly at my feet. My relationship with Spanky challenged a lot of society's ingrained prejudices. He might be from the Stone Age. But Spanky was as clear-eyed, eager, and downright playful as any of my cousin's kids. Which goes to show you that people are people no matter what era they're from. Spanky and I hung out a lot. He would show me things about his culture, which was in perfect harmony with the environment of the Ballium Valley. He even taught me how to shoot the Danny's little bow. The Danny lived off their ability to use it. I certainly couldn't. We also played catch. Spanky couldn't get enough of the simple companionship of throwing the ball back and forth on a sunny day in Shangri-La. Meanwhile, the Queen had taken a shine to Maggie. The Danny had the Stone Age equivalent of a king and a queen, and their hut was comparable to Buckingham Palace. So, Once in a while, the Queen would invite Maggie over for hot sweet potatoes. It wasn't high tea and finger sandwiches, but the concept was the same. Maggie told me that, from an American point of view, the only thing lacking from the afternoons she spent with the Queen was a front porch and some rocking chairs. In fact, the Queen was so attuned to Maggie that she hissed at me when I teased Maggie about her royal connections, even though the Queen didn't understand a word of English. Naturally, the Queen's husband fell head over heels in love with Maggie. So one day he began to brush her hair. Of course, Mags didn't realise that that act amounted to the King's declaration that she was his new wife. More pertinently, the old wife saw it as the Danny equivalent of catching the King with Maggie bent over the arm of a sofa. So, understandably, she flew into a violent rage. I was standing nearby, like I always was whenever Maggie ventured among the Danny, and I heard squawks and commotion centred around Maggie's voice. I rushed over to find that several of the Danny women were in the process of trying to cut the tips off of Maggie's fingers. In fact, that wasn't as bizarre as it sounds, because it was a common form of mourning among Danny women. I arrived on the scene breathing fire and everything stopped. I mean, seriously. I was twice anybody's size and 2 feet taller. I said angrily, "What the fuck are you doing?" They didn't understand English, but they knew what anger looked like. They immediately released Maggie, grunting and clicking like the whole group was saying, "What got up his arse?" Maggie rushed to my side, looking frightened. My spirited little friend might be adamant about self-reliance, and there are times when a woman doesn't need a man's help, but there are also times when she does. This was one of those times. I pointed to Maggie. Then I pointed to me and said, "This is my woman." I made a striking motion and added, "If you harm her, you will have to fight me." The group stepped back a few more paces, making awestruck noises. Maybe the Stone Age wasn't a half-bad place to be if you're as big as I was. Maggie began to splutter behind me. I told her, "Shut your yap, squirt. I'm making a point." Then I turned to the group and said, "This woman is under my protection, so you will not touch her." The group didn't know what I'd said, but they got the point. There was a new queen in town. Maggie, who'd understood every word I'd said, looked at me oddly. We walked back to our camp together. I said teasingly, "Maybe you should spend a little less time with the Danny, Your Highness." Maggie snapped back angrily, "Your woman, huh?" How did I know she was going to say that? Then she added under her breath, "Maybe that wouldn't be so bad." That was an odd thing to say. The next day's flight brought the usual crates, but the C-47 circled back and 4 parachutes blossomed. Maggie and I walked down to the river to meet the new additions. Her gangrene was getting slightly better thanks to the sulphur, but it was still a serious concern that she might lose one of her shapely legs because of it. The 4 men were gathering their chutes as we approached. 2 looked like Filipinos. The leader of the group was an American with a silver bar on his collar. I saluted and said, "Staff Sergeant, Handshoe, sir, 39th Troop Carrier Squadron." I gestured toward Maggie, who limped up behind me and added, "Corporal Margaret Hastings, Women's Army Corps. We're 2 of the 3 survivors of the crash." The guy looked at me. Then he looked at Maggie, and I thought his eyes were going to fall out of his head. He returned my salute and said, "Captain Earl Walter, 1st Filipino Airborne, we're here to get you out." Then he turned to Maggie and said, "So this is the famous adventure girl." Maggie and I were stunned. What the fuck was he talking about? Then a guy who was clearly a civilian sauntered up. He shook my hand, turned to Maggie, and said briskly, "Alex Can, let me explain what I'm here to do." It turned out that Can was a journalist, and he'd parachuted in with a camera to get the scoop. Word had leaked out about the crash, and we were famous. That was news to both of us, since our accident had been nothing but a junket. However, it was embarrassing to the army. So, its PR minions had to fabricate a story that would be more palatable to the American public. Hence, to properly spin it, they focused on the brave little WAC with the clear, firm voice. And the story of Maggie Hastings, the adventure girl, gripped America. The Danny treated the 4 new arrivals in the same fashion as they had treated us. It was like the white people were putting on a special show to entertain them. Large groups of curious Danny hung around the fringes jabbering, while we set up tents and a field hospital to treat Maggie and Decker. Both of them had to be able to walk long distances in order for us to be able to move to the next stage of the rescue. The sulphur I'd been spreading on Maggie's sores had done wonders with the gangrene, and she was on the road to recovery. Decker was another matter. His head wound was to the bone, and his burns were serious. So it would take a little more time to get him back in shape. Accordingly, we set up a tent village next door to the Danny. There was our tent, and then there were 3 new ones. Walter had his own little one. The medics and Can were in a big one like ours, and there was the fully stocked medical tent. The trouble began when the Filipinos began to set up a 5th tent. Army PR didn't want anybody back home thinking that their alluring little WAC was sleeping in the same tent as Decker and me. I mean, what would the American people say if they found out the adventure girl was saying nighty-night to a couple of grotty male enlistees? So, the Filipinos were establishing a private tent to preserve Maggie's dubious virtue. That set off a major screaming match. The 3 of us had been through hell together, and Maggie would sleep with her comrades. Period. No compromise. Her adamant insistence on being with us was a new feature. Maggie Hastings was loyal to a fault. Maggie won the round by angrily stomping off. I was concerned that Maggie was disobeying orders. Walter was a captain, she was a corporal, and we were still in the army. So, I sidled up to the captain, just to ensure that there would be no blowback. He was staring fascinated at Maggie's beautiful round butt as she disappeared in the direction of her river pool. She was obviously going for a swim. I said calmingly, "She'll get with the program when she gets back to civilization." He turned to me, and I recognized the look. He'd fallen under Maggie's spell. He said, awestruck, "What a magnificent woman." I didn't think much about that statement until the romance commenced, and of course Maggie didn't discourage Walter either. Now Maggie spent her evenings in Walter's tent drinking beer. Of course that ended our intimate evenings together, since I wasn't invited. I could hear her laughter as they both talked, and it made me jealous. I didn't blame either of them. It wasn't like Maggie was my girl. In fact, she'd made it plain that she was nobody's girl, and Maggie didn't appear to be doing anything sexual with Walter. She was just hanging out with the new guy. So I wasn't upset with her in any man-woman relationship sort of fashion. I just plain missed her. After the crash, our circumstances had gone from dire to desperate to living comfortably among the Danny, and we'd done it together. It had been Maggie and me against the world. But then again, that wasn't reality. Now we were back to the way things were before our special moment out of time. It gave me an empty feeling, as if my future had evaporated. There was an officer on the ground now. So, army discipline applied, and we enlisted were expected to toe the line, which we did in the form of following normal army protocol. Only Decker was excluded, mainly because he was flat on his back in the medical tent. Walter won the argument about living quarters too, by ordering me into the tent with the medics and Can. That left Maggie in our old tent by herself. The tent that I was crowded into was uncomfortable, but the upside was that it let me strike up a friendship with Can. That was when I discovered that truth is malleable, which kinda indicates how clueless I actually was. Apparently, all 3 of us survivors were famous back home. That's the reason why Can had parachuted in. He told me that the army knew how embarrassing the real circumstances of the crash were. So they called our joyride to Shangri-La navigation training, which was an outright lie. Now the Danny went from being headhunters to very happy people in the news releases. It was disillusioning. Can added, "In fact, the army said that the Danny were so friendly that they had made Maggie Queen of Shangri-la." I said offhandedly, "They actually did." Can said astounded, "Wait, what?" I said, "The king brushed her hair. Apparently that makes her queen." Then I went on to describe the incident. Can was frantically scribbling in a notebook, After Can was finished, he sat back with a twinkle in his eye and said, "The army bent over backward to assure the American people that there was no hanky-panky going on up here. But Maggie's a bombshell, so was there?" I laughed out loud and said, "Get real. Maggie Hastings is the strongest and bravest companion a guy could ever ask for. Plus, a beauty like Maggie is way out of this boy's league. In fact, she's out of most fellas' league except for maybe a movie star. Anyhow, she was toughing out serious burns on her legs. So, what do you think happened?" Can looked disappointed. Then he said, "I guess it doesn't matter. Besides, the army sanitized it for back home. They dug up a staff sergeant Maggie was dating before the crash who claimed to be her fiancé. Most of us thought that story was baloney. But who cares? They even interviewed your girl Patsy, just to reassure everybody that nothing was happening between you and Corporal Hastings." I said, "What?" Can went on, like he hadn't dropped the world's biggest and most horrible bomb on me. "You know, Patsy, your girl in Wisconsin, the one you're going to marry when you get back." I was so totally flabbergasted that I could only croak, "What did she say?" Can said, "I read about it in the Reader's Digest. Patsy said that she is happy and waiting for your return. In the meantime, she's taking care of the baby boy that her mother just had." Can laughed and added, "It ought to give her good training for when you two start having babies of your own." I jumped to my feet and shot out of the tent, leaving Can sitting there speechless. I was praying that what Can had just told me was a concoction of the army PR machine. If it wasn't, it explained everything. Remember, I hadn't gotten the letter from my mum yet. So, I didn't know why Patsy had sent me the Dear John. Can's news about the baby made me feel like I was being electrocuted. I had to go someplace where I could wrestle my emotions back under control. Hence, I was sitting on my usual rock near Maggie's pool when she sat down next to me. She said curiously, "What was that all about? Why did you go bolting out of your tent?" Was Maggie keeping track of me? I said, "Do you know that our love life is a subject of great interest to all of America?" Maggie laughed loudly, slapped her knee and said, "They couldn't get mine past the censors." I said, "They interviewed a staff sergeant named Wally, who you are supposed to be engaged to, and even worse, they interviewed my Patsy, and she clearly has a baby. The article said it was her mother's, but her mum's 51 and her husband's been dead for years." Maggie's tanned face had turned almost purple as she spluttered, "That asshole told them that I was his fiancé. I'll kill him. We've gone out a couple of times and we had a date lined up for a midnight swim after the flight. But that's all there ever was. I haven't even fucked him." And given my current feelings about Maggie, I didn't need to know that. Then, the other thing that I'd said dawned on her, and she put a hand on my arm in sympathy. It was the first time she had touched me in a friendly fashion. She said, "That changes things for you, doesn't it?" I said, close to tears, "You're damn right." I was hoping that maybe Patsy would change her mind once I got back into town. But if she has a baby, there's nothing there for me now. I'm not raising somebody else's kid. Maggie said, her voice loaded with irony. "Well, that sure does blow up the saving it for our wedding night argument." Then she saw how hurt I was and added encouragingly, "Buck up. There are a lot of fish in the sea, and a good-looking guy like you won't have any trouble catching one, especially after this adventure." I said, "That's easy for you to say. You're the most attractive woman I've ever known." She made a face and said, "I thought you considered yourself too good for a bad girl like me." I said, perhaps a bit too effusively, "God, no. You're the strongest, bravest, and most beautiful person I've ever known." Maggie gave me a stare like she thought I was an idiot. Then she abruptly stood, brushed herself off and walked away. She said back over her shoulder, "Maybe you ought to think about what you just said, cowboy, and you had better be able to put your thoughts into action when you do." It was another 2 weeks before Decker and Maggie were healthy enough to trek down to the base camp, which was where the rescue was planned. The problem was that there wasn't enough room to land a plane where we were. So, the army came up with an ingenious solution. They would snatch us out in a glider. Gliders don't require nearly as much space to land as a powered plane, So, the idea was to bring a Waco CG-4A glider into a landing strip, which another group of Filipino paratroopers had hacked out of the jungle. Those guys were dropped further down the valley where the jungle was less dense and the surrounding peaks a little lower. We'd sit in the glider while a low-flying C-47 with a dangling steel hook snagged a big ring suspended 20 feet above the ground, which was attached to the glider's tow rope. The tow plane would be going 120 miles per hour, and the glider would be airborne in 60 feet, while accelerating from 0 to 120 miles per hour in 7 seconds. The concept had already been used to retrieve empty gliders, so they knew it could be done. But the trick of snatching out humans was still in its experimental stage. We were going to be the guinea pigs for the first attempt. Great! The story of my life. What could possibly go wrong with that plan? Thus, on the early morning of June 27th, 47 days after our crash, the 7 of us began the hike to the snatch point. We had enlisted a group of Danny men to help us carry our gear. We'd paid them with seashells, which was their coinage per se. Little Spanky had been hanging around with tears in his eyes during our preparation. He knew that he would never see me again. I got down on one kidney, opened my arms. The smelly little guy ran into them for a big hug. I said, "Be well, my dear little friend. I'll miss you." He reached down at his feet and came up with a puppy. It was one of the wild dogs that the Danny keep. Spanky treated him like his pet, which was uncommon, since the Danny mostly used them for food. The fact that Spanky was nurturing a dog said a lot about his tender heart. Then he handed him to me in that universal gesture of friendship. The last thing I needed was a puppy. I was about to trek 10 miles, then I was going to be snatched into the air by an untested system. But Spanky looked so sincere. The pup was his only possession, and he wanted to give him to me as a gesture of his love. I couldn't say no. I reached out, took the squirmy little thing, and said sincerely, "Thank you." Of course I had to give him something in return. What to do? Then the idea hit me. My jackknife was advanced technology among the Danny, almost like a Martian ray gun. So I reached in my pocket and produced the knife. Spanky had played with it before, and he was in awe of it. I opened his little hand and put the knife in it, making the same gesture he had with the dog. Spanky's face split into a grin and he said, "The coup." Click. It was a tender moment. People are people, no matter what kind of wrapper they come in. I looked back and waved to him as we marched off into the jungle in a line. Spanky waved back. It was the last I ever saw of him. I hoped my little pal became king of the Danny someday. He had the intelligence and big heart to be a great leader. The walk took the entire day. The Filipinos had set up a camp at the edge of a clear space. So we 7 dropped our gear, grabbed some food, and sat by the fire waiting for the sun to rise on June 28th, 48 days after our crash. There was plenty of beer. So I took a couple of cans of Pabst and my dog Buster. Maggie liked to call me Buster Brown whenever she was irritated with me. Buster Brown was the dorky kid in all of the shoe ads, with the nauseatingly chipper voice. So, I named my new pup Buster, just to jerk her chain. Buster and I found a remote place to sit. I liked Can, but I couldn't stand the constant flirting between Maggie and Walter. Plus, I'm an antisocial son of a bitch, and Buster was about as much company as I could handle. We were going back to real life the next day, and I'd discovered, to my utter surprise, that I regretted leaving. The past month and a half had been idyllic, just Maggie and me, and I knew that I would lose all access to her the moment we got back. That's because life would go back to the way it was before the crash, where I was an enlisted Shermo, and Maggie was, well, she was Maggie. Maggie had gotten under my skin big time. It wasn't because she was gorgeous. I had never had any ambitions about her that way. It was just that her presence completed me. Her worldliness and confidence filled in the gaps, and I felt comfortable in my own skin. I also knew that I had to get that yearning out of my system, because Maggie Hastings was gone from my life. Forever. I was just finishing the second can and was contemplating sleep when Buster yelped a warning. I could already tell that he was a faithful little beast, even though he was only 3 or 4 months old. Then, to my total astonishment, Maggie sat down next to me. She gave me her frank and knowing look and said, "Back to being above it all, cowboy." I didn't have the stones to tell her that I was mourning her loss, so I gave her a welcoming glance and said, "It was horrible and wonderful, wasn't it, Squirt? I almost wish civilization hadn't showed up." Maggie clearly understood what I was talking about. Her face transformed from her usual jaunty, hard-assed self into something much softer. It was a new look, and it promoted her already celestial beauty into something very special. She said sentimentally, "We made it together, just you and me. I'll never forget it. You're maybe the only person in the world I trust." I said fondly, "Me too. You've restored my faith in women, Maggie Hastings." Then I hastily added, "Laura helped too. You are both women of great wisdom and kindness. I suppose you expected us to light up the jungle with wild passion after that tender moment. If you did, then you entirely missed the point. Both of us were outsiders. Me because I was self-conscious and shy. Maggie because every guy tried to harness her free spirit. We were thrown into a situation where we had to depend on each other, and we had formed a bond. We would both miss our unique connection." I said quietly, "Will I be able to see you after we get back?" Maggie gave me a deep, probing look and said, "That depends on you, cowboy." Every ounce of her complex personality was rolled into that statement. Then, without another word, she rose and walked back to the rest of the group. I got it. Maggie was telling me that social distance was just plain bullshit. We'd proven that over the past month. Still, bridging the gap is easier said than done. I thought to myself, I survived the Ballium Valley, so anything's possible. But I still had a lot of growing and learning to do. With that, I stood, brushed myself off and headed back. My little pal waddled along faithfully on his short puppy legs. The next day's rescue was anticlimactic. First there was the distant sound of a C-47. It passed overhead, and a CG-4A glider, with a skid on its underside, landed on the rough strip that the Filipino troopers had carved out of the jungle. We manhandled the glider back around into takeoff position, and the tow rope was attached to the snatch ring. The front of the glider swung open like a hinged box, and Maggie, Decker, Walter and I, along with the 2 medics and Buster, were hustled into it and strapped down. Maggie made it a point to be strapped in next to me. We exchanged companionable glances. Then we all liked arms, while I clutched Buster to my chest. He whimpered, then tried to lick my face. He trusted me. I heard a low-flying C-47 swoop overhead, which was followed by a shock, and we were snatched into the air. It was a lot gentler than I'd expected. The trip back to Hollandia took an hour and 20 nerve-wracking minutes. I was painfully aware of how Wasp engines perform at high altitude, so I was concerned that they might overheat. I know. I worry too much. The glider released from the C-47 tug and silently circled to land. As it did, I looked out the big front window and saw a mob on the runway. The glider had a skid, not wheels. So, the pilot chose to put it on the grassy verge rather than the mast and mat. The landing was a lot rougher than the snatch, and I almost lost my grip on Buster. Maggie was clinging to my elbow for dear life. The grinding and shaking stopped, and we all relaxed. Maggie gave me an uncharacteristic sad look. We both knew that this was our last time together, just her and me. The instant Maggie stepped out of the glider, she would be mobbed by a pack of generals and reporters, all clamouring to meet the Queen of Shangri-la. Napoleon once said that an army marches on its belly, meaning logistics is critical to battlefield success. But public relations wasn't far behind in this new age of worldwide electronic news, and the army had itself a PR bonanza. Maggie was beautiful, incredibly photogenic, and a genuine heroine. The flashing of the cameras was continuous as we emerged from the glider. We all posed together in front of the aircraft, Then, an army PR flak grabbed Maggie and whisked her off into the maelstrom of reporters. He put up a hand to stop Decker and me as we started to follow and said, "You two will get your chance later." Which was fine with me since I didn't want anything to do with the circus that was going on around Maggie. For her part, Maggie knew how to work the press. The newsies gathered around her in a baying gaggle. She coolly brushed back the wind-blown bob that I'd given her after the crash and told the newsreel cameras, "I'm sure glad to be back. Hollandia never looked better." When somebody shouted, "What's the first thing that you want to do?" her sassy reply was, "I'd like a shower and a permanent." The reporters wrote up the entire fiasco, as if Maggie was returning from a trip to the beach, rather than almost 2 months in a primeval jungle. That was the impression that the army wanted to give. They told their slavering readership that Maggie was extraordinarily fit. Her hazel eyes sparkled, and her face was tanned. The army PR flaks bundled Maggie off to the WACs quarters as soon as the press conference ended. I stood alone on the tarmac holding my little dog. I thought, I'm getting tired of being abandoned. But still, I wasn't heartbroken like I was after I got the letter from Patsy. I just felt hollow, like the most important piece of my soul had been sawed off. Naturally, Maggie was a media sensation, the army's rising star. People back home were thrilled by the tale of the brave little WAC, stranded in the jungle like Robinson Crusoe, and then brought safely back. They scrambled to find New Guinea on the map, and they read Lost Horizon. Neither the army nor the press wanted that uplifting story to end. The hype went on, and the army tried to control every aspect of Maggie's public persona, especially since they knew that her private one was a bit tarnished. Accordingly, they assigned her a group of media handlers whose only duty was to keep everybody else, especially the press, at arm's length. The army was going to use Maggie Hastings for all she was worth. She was a good news in the midst of all the depressing casualty statistics. And so, the feel-good story of the Queen of Shangri-la knocked the bad news out of the headlines for weeks. Knowing Maggie as I did, I was certain that she hated her new role as darling of the press. Still, there was no way for her to escape her notoriety. I saw Maggie again at the evening press conference. She had a fresh new hairdo, a crisp corporal's uniform, and bright red nail polish. She was fantastic. Of course, that was the whole idea. The look on Maggie's face told me that she was already getting tired of being trotted around like a show horse. But we were both in the army, and orders are orders. Decker and I were clearly superfluous, but the army needed bookends for tiny little Maggie. The idea was for us to frame the most illustrious young woman of the war, the army's pin-up girl. She's blonde, she's cute, she's the #1 adventure girl of World War II. Oh yeah, and there's also those 2 stiffs who survived along with her. Decker and I stood by appalled as Maggie answered question after question. I was in awe of her easy, almost flirtatious manner. I finally turned to Decker and said, "Do you want to be part of that?" Decker didn't talk much. I don't know whether it was because of his head wound or it was just who he was. He turned to me, horrified, and said, "God, no! I wouldn't go through that for $1 million." I said sympathetically, "I'm with you there, brother." The army knew Maggie's story was solid gold, so they kept her off limits from everybody. Even so, a couple of enterprising journalists managed to climb through a back window and into her building. They were quickly spotted, mainly because they were in a female barracks. After that, the army posted MPs all around the place to keep out every inquisitive guy, including me. Over the following days, I mourned losing my connection with Maggie. I mean, it would have been hard to start a meaningful relationship with a woman like Maggie under normal circumstances. But it was hopeless now. Even worse, I didn't have a duty assignment to distract me. So, I just moped around the barracks waiting for the army to decide what to do with me. Once more, I felt like my life was over. My profound sense of loss lasted for a week. Then I got orders to report to GHQ Sepak. There, a slick army captain told me that all 3 of us were going on a Liberty Bond tour back in the States. Maggie was the Army's million-dollar baby, and America was clamoring to meet her. Oh, and by the way, you and Decca are going along too. My heart leapt at the chance to be with Maggie again. Silly man. You know the gods use you as their personal speed bag. That very same day, the Army loaded Maggie on a C-54 Skymaster and flew her back to the States for a glamorous welcome and a 7-week excursion around America. Me? I was dumped on a destroyer that happened to be heading back to Oakland, California. It took almost a month. I was met at the gangplank by a skinny guy in a major's uniform. He looked about as unmilitary as any person I'd ever met. It turned out that he was a Hollywood agent who'd signed up for the duration as an alternative to being sentenced for unspecified sex offences. His name was Spencer, with an S, and he was a genius at moving the product, meaning he was a snake oil salesman. The two of us taxied over to the 1400 bar in West Alameda, me in my starched Master Sergeant's uniform, Spencer in his rumpled and ill-fitting major suit. And yes, I'd been promoted for meritorious service, meaning I'd kept my mouth shut about the real reason why I was stranded in Shangri-La. It was dark in that seedy joint as we grabbed a table, me with a beer and him with a couple of shots of rye. Spencer looked me over slyly and said, "So you're the hayseed who engineered the whole thing?" What the fuck was he talking about? I said, "I don't know what you mean by engineered, but I was the least injured, so I was responsible for getting the other two some help." He said, delighted, "Good, we can work with that." Then he proceeded to pepper me with questions, everything from why I wasn't hurt to how we managed to live with the Danny without them eating us. I laughed and said, "They're as friendly as the people in my small town. I even taught them how to play baseball." Spencer got an incredulous look, gulped his second shot, and ordered 2 more. He said, like the professional con man he was, "Tell me that again." So I proceeded to tell him Spanky's story. I even mentioned that I had a little dog that Spanky had given me when we parted company. I said, "Buster is a Danny wild dog. He's kind of fat, but he's a really good mutt. They're keeping an eye on him for me back in my quarters on the ship." The look on Spencer's face told me that he thought he'd struck oil in the most unexpected of places. He said excitedly, "I can spin that. It'll be a big hit. About how you brought America's pastime to a bunch of cannibals. The American people will love it. And you gotta bring that pup too." Spencer had insulted the shit out of the Danny, but I wasn't going to try to straighten him out, since I would have probably thought the same thing before the crash. I'd changed a lot since then. And of course, I was still in the Army, where survival is contingent on getting with the program. I liked all of those stripes and I wanted to keep them, so I did what I had to do. Throughout August and into September, the Army sent me on a whistle-stop tour of the Midwest. Just me, Spencer, and my faithful canine companion. Spencer would do the scene setting and then I'd tell my story. My chubby little pal didn't look much like a wild dog, and Buster's frequent attempts to lick my face weren't convincing anybody that he was ferocious. So instead, Spencer wanted me to put my emphasis on the Danny's taste for dogs, so to speak. That was totally concocted. But there wouldn't be much red meat if I'd just told the American people about spending a month and a half with friendly Stone Age folks. Only anthropologists care about that shit. The audience wanted tales of leaping flames and dancing savages, tending a big iron pot. And if I wasn't the occupant of that pot, then they needed somebody who was. They'd split the 3 of us up geographically. Decca was from Texas, so they gave him the South. I was from Wisconsin, so I got the Midwest. The Queen of Shangri-la got the East and all the big cities. Maggie finished her tour in New York. I saw a photo of her in the Times. The caption said that she was attending Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral while awaiting her boyfriend, Sergeant Wally Fleming. He was the guy Maggie had the moonlight swim date with before the crash. It didn't bother me that Maggie was photographed bestowing her shining self on Fleming. I knew that particular romance was no different than the girl back home waiting for me, with Duke Williams's bastard child in hand. The truth should never get in the way of a good story. So, While Maggie toured places like San Francisco, Denver, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, I was enjoying the many delights of places like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Toledo, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and inevitably Milwaukee. That last stop was unfortunate. The Bond rally was at the National Guard Armory down by the Milwaukee River. The date was September 17th. The war had ended in August, and the army planned to muster me out the following day, after I'd done my last boy and his dog show. Consequently, my entire family drove over to listen to my utterly contrived fairy tale of survival in the Stone Age. Under Spencer's tutelage, the story had evolved to the point where the Danny were playing baseball like a Brewers farm team, and I was Casey Stengel, who was the Brewers manager at the time. It was fucking embarrassing. I had trained Buster to put his paws over his eyes when I informed the curious people about how the Danny used dogs, which elicited gales of laughter. Everything went as it always had until I spotted my parents standing in the audience. That was expected. The person I wasn't expecting was Patsy, who was standing there holding a baby. I paused and just stared at her, with my mouth working like a boated fish. Spencer hissed angrily, "Get on with it, kid!" I shook my head and picked up where I'd left off. But my heart was in my throat. God, I don't need this! There was the normal polite applause. Then the audience began to wander over to the booth where you could plop down $18 and get 25 back, 10 years later. Peanuts, I know. But it was a different time and place. Mum and Pop headed toward me with Patsy trailing shyly along behind. I whispered to myself, I survived the Balium Valley. I can survive this. Mum gave me a hug and Dad solemnly shook my hand. He said, "Welcome back, son." Wisconsin Germans aren't big on expressing their emotions. Then Patsy walked up, shifted the bruiser she was carrying onto her other arm. She kissed me on the cheek and said nervously, "Welcome home, Eric." I said the first thing that came into my head, "Glad to be back," which was incredibly stupid. But how do you talk to your past? I mean, Patsy was my old life. I still had plenty of residual affection for Patsy, just no love. I had grown into a completely different person now thanks to Maggie Hastings. 6 months ago, Patsy had been my everything. Since then, I had survived a plane crash, buried a dear friend, and lived for a month with headhunters. More importantly, I had shared life and death situations with a woman who, in my mind, outshone every other female in the world. So, unfortunately for me, Maggie Hastings was the only woman I would ever want, and I knew it. I greeted Patsy in a welcoming and friendly fashion. The look in her eye told me that she was hoping for a whole lot more, but I just couldn't give it to her. That didn't involve any moral judgments about the kid. In fact, I considered Patsy a victim of a totally amoral predator. I would have viewed the baby as a stunning betrayal 5 months ago. Now the kid was more of a bullet that I'd dodged. Patsy stared at me for a couple of seconds, questioning, and then she looked away. I think she knew what the answer was. Patsy was always very smart. Still, she had to try. Tears were glistening in her eyes. I hugged her and said, "I will never forget you." That was the best I could do, and it wasn't a matter of the baby. I didn't hate Patsy. I'd simply grown past her. The ironic part was that my feelings would have been the same if Patsy was as virginal as I still was. Because I'd changed dramatically. I had no future with any other woman who was not named Maggie Hastings. And so there was no point in encouraging Patsy out of sheer pity. Your life is already mapped out for you if you live in a small town. It might be a dull and pointless existence, but it's comfortable. You work, you take care of your family, and then you drift off into old age, all the while enjoying the pleasures of your wife, kids, and friends. It's comfortable. But that wasn't going to be my fate. The draft uprooted me and then gave me 2.5 years of life experiences, most of them unpleasant. Yet, it also opened my eyes. More importantly, I'd known people who weren't like me. Everybody from Tail Gunner Jimmy, through kind and gentle Laura, to the peerless Maggie Hastings had built a new perspective for me. The sum total of all of that had made me a different person. Patsy was better than she had ever looked, and I knew that she would make a loving and faithful wife. But I had been too many places and done too many things to ever be satisfied working at the Grange. So, I was friendly with Patsy, and even affectionate with little Eric. Yes, she'd named the kid after me. Of course, Maggie Hastings was the primary factor in that decision. Patsy didn't know Maggie, but she could sense that I'd moved on, and there was no turning back. I later heard that Patsy married Heinrich Dorf and was happily popping out a kid a year. She got the life she wanted, but it wasn't for me. After my discharge, I used the GI Bill to enroll in the engineering school at UW. I was still only 23, and just a few years older than my classmates. So I was assigned a room in Slichter Hall just like every other freshman, but I had already had a lifetime of experience. They hadn't. They were children and they acted like kids away at summer camp. I was used to barracks life, so the racket didn't bother me. But the freshman hijinks drove me nuts. Naturally, I reverted to the way I was in the army, meaning I became the same loner that I was in Hollandia. I attended class, studied, and kept to myself. Needless to say, I wasn't the most popular guy on campus. Nevertheless, I did solve my virginity problem. Most of the student body was aware that I was the Shangri-La guy, which gave me a certain amount of notoriety, especially since I exuded an air of brooding mystery. Seriously, if you'd buried as many friends as I had, who wouldn't? So naturally, I attracted the kind of silly romantic female who had notions of playing Catherine to my Heathcliff. Really, every one of those deluded women thought that they could cure me of my ennui. Of course, that wasn't going to happen, because I'd discovered, to my utter horror, that I was never going to be able to move past Maggie Hastings. God knows they all tried. I must have equalled the number of Maggie's conquests by the end of my sophomore year. And let me stop you right there. I was serially monogamous, not a man-whore like Jimmy, meaning I was never fucking more than one woman at a time. But there was no spark, no sense that I wanted to spend my life with any of them. I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted to share my life with a person I could respect, a woman with the courage and strength I'd seen in Maggie Hastings. I mean, you simply can't settle once you've seen what the pinnacle looks like. So, I kept moving, from one woman to another. I mean, seriously. I knew I could never have a normal life with a woman who wasn't up to the standard that Maggie set. Common sense spent time arguing with my psyche about that. But I finally accepted that I had to take a shot at Maggie, because I kept comparing every other woman to her. Maggie might laugh in my face, as I assumed she would. But then I'd have my answer and I could move on. Nevertheless, the fact remained that I was in love with a phantom, a ghost. I had no idea where Maggie was or what she was doing. There was a short period after the war when the press still covered the adventure girl, so at least I could keep track of her. But after 4 long years apart, Maggie might have just as well have been lost in Shangri-La. Then, without warning, the dilemma was solved by my roommate's Philco radio. One evening, I was sitting at my uncomfortable dorm desk trying to make sense out of thermodynamics, when I heard a name. There were such outlandish odds that it would be a name I recognized that I almost missed it. But I distinctly heard the words, Maggie Hastings. I bounded across the room, turned the volume all the way up, and discovered that it was Ralph Edwards' This Is Your Life show on the NBC network. The life that they were featuring that week was the Queen of Shangri-la. I thought. So they hadn't totally forgotten World War II's adventure girl after all. I sat in rapt attention while they reviewed Maggie's life, from her tomboy girlhood, to her volunteering for the WACs, to the crash and its aftermath. The story was phony as hell, featuring things like the Dani throwing spears at RC-47 as it crashed, and her unrequited love life. Even then, American media was geared to the lowest denominator. The key fact was that Maggie was living in Owego, New York. At the end of the show, Edwards asked Maggie about her marital plans. I mean, she was single and female, she must have plans. My spunky little friend told Edwards, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't know whether she could ever go for the kind of man who's supposed to make a good husband. Maggie didn't suffer fools, and she always said it like it was. The only fact I cared about was that Maggie was still unmarried. That was when something Maggie had told me began to reverberate through my brain like a news flash from heaven. When I'd asked her if I'd ever see her again. She'd said, "That depends on you, cowboy." And suddenly it all made sense. Destiny had set the table, and this time I wasn't going to disappoint the woman of my dreams. I wasn't the naive little weenie Maggie had met at Rosie's, and I was infinitely wiser and more experienced than the guy she'd thrown her challenge down to the night before we returned to Hollandia. I said to myself, I might not make a good husband, but I can be a great lifelong companion. When I'd signed up to live in a dorm, I had worked out an accommodation with the university to let Buster live with me. They knew that I was a vet, and they also knew that I'd been semi-famous, at least for a few months in 1945. Any guy who has been to war needs somebody like Buster, so their only condition was that Buster would not cause them any heartburn. I had no hesitation making that deal because I knew that Buster was everything good about a dog. Full grown, he was about the size of a lab. He was brown and smelly, and he drooled a lot. But he was also the only creature I could talk to. He would lie with his chin on his paws, long ears draped over his front legs and love in his eyes, while I exorcised the demons that World War II had implanted in my mind. As soon as the show ended, I turned to Buster and said, "Well, old buddy, I think the time has come for me to grow a set. I always felt like Maggie was out of my league, but I'm not the backward and naive little boy I used to be. So I've got to give her a shot. I mean, I can't live my life forever looking backward. So I need to get my ass to Owego ASAP and close this deal." I thought for another second and added, "If Maggie feels the same way I do, then I'll know that I have somebody I can cherish for the rest of my life." Of course, I had to wait for the semester to end, but I'd already let almost 4 years pass. The moment I had my new engineering degree, I headed for the town of Owego. Only rich people travelled by air in those days. So Buster and I took the 20th Century Limited to Grand Central, then the Greyhound to Owego. They made me buy a seat for him on both. Owego is a dreary little blue-collar town in the middle of southern New York, close to the Pennsylvania border. It's a crossing point on the Susquehanna River, which is probably the reason why people settled there. Most of Wisconsin looks just like that place. So, I felt right at home. It was raining as the bus dumped Buster and me at the stop across from the Tioga County Courthouse. I headed for the shelter of the courthouse because I knew that it would have a phone book. There was only one M. Hastings in the book. She lived on Page Street. So I asked the guard loitering by the door of the courthouse to show me how to get there. He got an angry look. Then he laughed and said, "You ain't gonna get anything out of her." I said, truly puzzled, "What are you talking about?" He said, challenging, "You're here to talk to the adventure girl, ain't you?" I got it. There must have been herds of reporters still trying to interview Maggie. I chuckled and said, "I am looking for Maggie Hastings, but I was one of the guys she survived the plane crash with. I just wanted to look her up and see how she was doing." Nah. Anybody hearing that would take that statement for a grain of salt. Guys only wanted to talk to Maggie Hastings because she was a legendary beauty. But still, the guard's demeanour changed. He said, with a certain amount of respect in his voice, "You were one of the fellows who lived with Maggie among all them cannibals." I said, starting to feel impatient. "Right you are. Now where's her house?" He smiled and said, "Maggie works at the hotel over there," and he pointed at a structure on the river. He added, "Her dad used to manage it, but he's sick. She moved back to help him." I got a couple of things out of that conversation. First, although Owego was bigger than my hometown, it was no different. Everybody knew everybody else's business. The second was the absurd image of tough and feisty Maggie Hastings as the dutiful daughter. She was a mystery wrapped in an enigma. The rain had stopped, so Buster and I sauntered the 3 blocks over to Maggie's place of business. It was a hotel, and the appearance of a dishevelled stranger in the foyer, along with his smelly dog, drew the immediate ire of the desk clerk. He shouted, "You can't come in here with that!" He was referring to Buster. I said mildly, "I'm here to see Maggie Hastings. Could you please ask her to step out on the porch? I'll wait for her there." Time passed while I stood, hands in my pockets, watching the swollen Susquehanna roll by. Then the screen door banged open, and Maggie charged out on the porch, fire in her eyes. Apparently, the desk clerk had told her that a vagrant and a mongrel wanted to see her, and she was royally pissed. Maggie hadn't changed in the slightest. She was as petite as ever. She had grown her honey blonde hair out to the point where it was before I'd cut it off. Her dazzling, highly expressive face was less tanned than it was when I'd last seen her. But her huge hazel eyes were as beautiful as ever. And of course, standing there on a damp porch in the middle of a rainy day, she simply radiated sex appeal. Maggie's expression went from fury to disbelief. Then there was a flash of utter joy before the shutters slammed shut, and her eyes were just as challenging and enigmatic as ever. That was all I needed to know. Maggie took another couple of steps toward me. Then she stood there, silently studying me, like I was a horse that she was thinking about buying. I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd pried open my mouth and counted my teeth. She tilted her head to one side and said in her husky voice, "So, you finally got the hint?" I answered just as coolly, "You said it was up to me, so here I am." Then I paused and added, "Squirt." Her eyes twinkled as she said, "I did say that, but I never thought you'd work out what I was telling you. I thought you'd be feeding cows in some hick town in Wisconsin." I said proudly, "Maybe you underestimated me, just like I did you at first. I have a Badger engineering degree now." Then I paused and added casually, "So what have you been doing since the rescue? You were famous for a while, but I kinda lost track of you until that radio show last month. That's how I knew where you were." Maggie said, slipping back into the easy banter that we had during our time in the Balium Valley. "Well, I was at Syracuse for a while, but I found out that I like to party more than study, so I'm back here temporarily until I find something else. It'll probably end up in the Big Apple." I said, heart in my throat. "Would you entertain an alternative proposition?" She gave me a look that nearly made me burst into flames and said, "Maybe. What do you have in mind?" I said, "Is there some place a little less public where we can talk?" Maggie said, "I have an office, but that mangy thing will have to stay out here. Is that the dog Spanky gave you when we left? He's grown up." She nodded at Buster, who was sitting next to a porch pillar, one leg pointed up as he delicately groomed his unmentionables. I looked at Buster. He paused what he was doing, leg still cocked, and said, "No worries, boss. Just tie me up out here. I don't want to go in there anyway." I wrapped Buster's leash around the post and followed Maggie's perfect round buns as she swayed their way past the disapproving desk clerk. Whether that butt was clad in an ugly WACs uniform or in the pleated wool skirt that she had on today, Maggie's arse and legs were a national treasure. Maggie had a small apartment on the opposite side of the lobby from the desk. It was a combination living quarters and hotel office. She sat down behind the desk and motioned for me to sit in the chair opposite. She wasn't going to make it easy, but that was my girl. Maggie took no prisoners. I'd been stone cold sure of myself a moment ago, but I was nervous now as I said, "You know why I'm here, so let's talk." Her huge, nearly amber eyes got an amused look as Maggie said, "Talk." I said, "I've thought about this a lot since we left the Balium Valley. Most people wouldn't have survived what happened to us, but we made it, and we did it because we worked together, just you and me." I paused and added meaningfully, "It formed a bond. I know you felt it too." Maggie nodded in agreement. So I went on with, "I was small-town America when we first met. Reserved, naive, self-conscious, and judgmental. But I got a bit smarter and a whole lot hipper after the crash. So I deal with the world as it is now, not the way I want it to be. I paused for emphasis and added, "That's all due to you. I never thought of us as a romantic couple, and I don't suppose you did either. But the fact remains that I am still alone, because I haven't met a woman who comes close to measuring up to you." I finished with a hopeful look on my face. "You're the only person I know I can respect. So, here I am hoping that you feel the same way. And maybe we could see what happens if we try life together." Maggie looked thoughtful for a minute. It was obvious that she had been thinking the same thing. Finally, she said, "When I was growing up, all a girl wanted was to find a guy to take care of her. I've always been different that way because the idea of marriage or even coupling up suffocates me." I must have looked dejected because Maggie hastened to add, "I like men, I like sex. And one of these days I'll find a guy who understands what equality in a relationship really means. The way I see it, a man and a woman are either partners, or there's no point in being together. Seriously, how are we going to watch each other's back if one of us thinks the other one is inferior? It's a matter of mutual respect." Maggie gave me one of her patented flirty smiles and said, "My problem is that guys see how I look and act, and they let their jealousy get in the way of their common sense. I know I wind men up. I can't help that. But the quickest way to turn me into an unfaithful bitch is to not trust me." I started to say something, but she interrupted. "If I make a commitment, then I live by it. That's who I am. But there's no way I can prove that except over time. So, the man I'm with has to be able to ignore the effect that I have on men and understand that they can trust me, because doubting me questions my integrity and my honor is very important to me." Maggie paused like she was getting to her final point and said, "I mean, I'm motivated by what I think is right. So if I promise to do something, then you had better believe I'll do it. I haven't met a man so far who understands that about me." She concluded with, "At first, I thought that all your brotherly attitude was pathetic, like maybe you were a queer or something. Then it dawned on me that you were treating me exactly as I wanted to be treated, as an equal, a comrade. And companions don't try to fuck each other." Maggie got a look like she had tasted something bitter and added, "The other guy," I assumed she meant Walter, "was always angling to get his hand up my dress." Then Maggie stopped, paused and said like it pained her, "Why didn't you even make a pass? You would have succeeded, you know. Hell. I even got naked in front of you and all you did was shoo off those kids who were throwing rocks at me," I said, with deep emotion in my voice. "You were my friend and companion. We were together in a very tough situation and you never failed me. So, my feelings for you ran a whole lot deeper than a simple roll in the hay. I loved your unconquerable spirit, not your stunning beauty. You are the person I admire the most in this world." I poured every ounce of sincerity into my next statement. "You're everything I value in a person. Tough, smart, brave and yet kind, compassionate and caring. Seeing you as a sexual conquest, like most guys would, just felt so wrong." Maggie looked like she was going to melt into a puddle right in front of me. I added with a laugh, "Plus, I knew that you would have killed me if I made a move on you back then. I was totally inexperienced and inhibited. But 4 years on a college campus teaches you a few things besides calculus. And I think I'm your equal in that department now." She got the familiar, challenging look in her eye, walked around the desk, stood in front of me and said decisively, "Prove it, cowboy." Maggie Hastings was 100 pounds of lightning in a bottle. I scooped her up without a word. She yelped, just like she did when I picked her up to carry her out of the jungle, and plopped her fabulous butt down on the edge of her desk. She threw her arms around my neck, and we kissed for the first time. It felt like the solar system ground to a halt, and unimaginable cosmic forces were unleashed. All of the women I had ever kissed before received the kiss. They didn't do the kissing. Maggie was a squirming bundle of sexual energy, and she was the aggressor. Her arms tightened around my neck as she pulled herself into me. A little time passed as Maggie tweaked and devoured my mouth with her beautiful sculpted lips. They were constantly in motion. Then she wrapped her legs around my arse and said urgently, "Move!" I understood what she was telling me to do. There was a single bed in the adjoining room. Maggie must have slept there as the manager. I turned and walked toward the bed, cautiously navigating while having the most erotic experience of my life. Tiny Maggie clung like a spider monkey, fiercely kissing me. I plopped her down on the bed and shed my pants like they were on fire. Maggie shucked her blouse and bra with the same enthusiasm. Then she reached down and skinned her panties down her leg. It was the same move she'd made when she took them off to stop Decca's bleeding. She bundled her skirt up to her middle and gave me a scorching look. I lingered for an instant to savour her fabulous body. Maggie Hastings was gorgeous, with wide, perfectly shaped breasts perched on her ribcage like a couple of nesting doves, an uncannily tiny waist, a flat stomach, and powerful womanly hips. But her legs were her real glory. Even with the pronounced burn scars, Maggie's thighs were longer and sleeker than average, and her lower legs were strong and muscular. It gave her the same leggy appearance as every animal built for speed. Of course, those instant impressions were secondary to the furious sexual tension in the room. Maggie was panting, almost gasping, her huge eyes focused on me with the intensity of a lioness on the hunt. I didn't bother removing my t-shirt. I just slid between her legs and up her body. As I did that, she seized the thing she desired most and guided it into the hottest, slipperiest 5 centimetres on earth. Maggie uttered a surprised Then, there was a moment of total clarity. It was like the joining filled all of the vulnerable places and made both of us whole. Maggie's eyes went wide with the recognition. She'd sensed it too. Then, our passion took over. We were Adam and Eve getting in touch with that most basic of human imperatives. Maggie's nearly golden eyes rolled up in her head, her pelvis elevated, and she began to frantically hump her lady parts against me. That lasted for perhaps 15 seconds, and then she erupted into a volcanic orgasm. I had never experienced a woman coming like that. I was barely getting started, which made me wonder that the rest of our lovemaking session would be like. I paused, while Maggie rested for a second. Then she slammed her heels against my butt, saying in a strangled tone, "More!" I'm an ex-master sergeant. I obey orders. What ensued was a mating event that might have been more apropos on the animal planet. Maggie Hastings might be tiny, but she was a moaning, scratching, and occasionally biting wildcat as she thrashed herself through a couple more orgasms. I was about to reach the end of the road, so I flipped her little body over onto her hands and knees. My first thought was of the brave little thing trying to crawl her way out of the jungle. Maggie made a sound of utter delight and arched her back to present buns that were legendary. I almost wept from the vision. It was like seeing a Van Gogh masterpiece. The hormonal smells, the moans, and the fact that Maggie had grabbed one of the pillows and was ravaging it with her teeth like a terrier with a rat tipped me over the top of a high mountain. I slid down the other side into a valley of total bliss. It wasn't Shangri-La, it was far superior to that. We took some time to recover. I'd shrunk out of Maggie and was lying on top of that exquisite arse almost crosswise. Finally, we scrambled back around to the classic man-woman position where I was on one elbow looking down at Maggie, who was lying there, still panting, and experiencing the occasional aftershock. And you don't understand our relationship if you think that there was anything sentimental going on. Maggie gave me her usual sassy smile and said, "You've learned a lot, cowboy." I said, smiling back at her, "You aren't so bad yourself, Squirt." We both descended into gales of laughter. Then it was time to be serious. Maggie said, "So, do we have a partnership of equals or not? You'll never own me, but you will never have a reason to doubt me either. I will be your comrade through thick and thin, just like we were back in Shangri-La. Could anybody expect more from their life partner?" I took a lingering look at Maggie and extended my right hand to shake. Luckily, it wasn't the one trapped under her sweaty but exquisite back, and said, "Comrades for life, that sounds good to me." It was a promise Maggie kept for 59 years. We married, and I built a career at a little airplane shop in the town of Bethpage on Long Island, where I was a lead engineer for the F-14 Tomcat. Maggie was an executive at the Waldorf. She never wanted to stop working. To her, it was an essential part of maintaining her freedom. Maggie would commute into the city on the LR, while at the same time raising a boy and a girl. It was tough at first, but Maggie was always there to soothe, support, and kick my ass. She never grumbled or complained. That was the woman she was, smart, tough, and realistic. Whatever we achieved in life, we did it together. Just as we'd agreed to do on that auspicious day an hour ago. We had friendly acquaintances, and we did all of the Nassau County suburban stuff. But Maggie and I had what the sociologists call a binary relationship. Meaning, I only needed Maggie, and she only needed me. It was a partnership forged in fire and nurtured in a community of headhunters, and it was unbreakable. We had each other. We learned to sail. A marriage is never boring if your wife is your first mate. We kept a 32-foot Beneteau in a slip in Oyster Bay, and we spent summers exploring the Sound, sometimes all the way up to the Vineyard. Maggie aged gracefully, but she never lost her feisty spirit, and we grew old together. Did I ever doubt her? Never. Maggie poured all of her exceptional energy into being the best person she could be. That had been her mantra for as long as I'd known her. So, you can imagine what happened when some idiot mistook Maggie's outgoing and flirty personality for permission to proceed. My wife may be tiny, but she's ferocious, and the red line she enforced was downright medieval. Maggie wasn't making any point to me with all of the slapping and berating. Those actions were purely self-motivated, her way of maintaining her sense of pride, and God knows she had plenty of that. Maggie's fearless approach to confrontation also applied when she was protecting her husband and kids. Pity the poor fool who messed with Maggie Hastings. Sadly though, even Maggie couldn't beat time. It was the #1 killer of women, breast cancer. They might have been able to do something if they'd caught it earlier. But Maggie was too tough. She never complained. Hence it was far too late by the time she did. Maggie fought it as valiantly and determinedly as she did with every other challenge, but fierce resolve won't delay the inevitable. The reality of going through the rest of my life without my life partner was devastating. But those are the cards that every couple will eventually get dealt, unless they go together. I wish I'd been first. The wind was kicking up and it had begun to rain, so I knocked out my pipe on a porch pillar and went inside to finish cleaning out the place. I wouldn't be needing it anymore. Hopefully I wouldn't need anything much longer. God willing. But I had one more chore to do. My daughter Laura was going to pick me up before dawn for a flight out of JFK. Maybe that would give me the peace I craved. Epilogue. The Trigana Air, ATR 42-300, circled and then dove between the high mountains. It leveled out and touched down lightly at Wamena Airport. Both pilots had made that approach hundreds of times, but landing in the Balium Valley was an adventure due to those encircling peaks. The twin-prop plane rolled to a stop in front of the little terminal, and the passengers began to disembark. A very old man was the last passenger off. He made his way gingerly down the boarding ladder with the help of one of the flight attendants. His only luggage was a tattered World War II Army backpack with a few clothes and an odd-shaped urn. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder and gazed around in wonder. It was as if the city of Wamena astonished him. The old man had expected native huts, not Western-style buildings sprawling from the river, almost to the highlands. The Trans-Papua Highway, built in the 1980s, had opened up the Balium Valley to commercialization. The old man gazed off into the distance, toward a low rise at the edge of the surrounding jungle. It was covered with neat farms and modern buildings. He shook his head in wonder, muttered, "Times have changed, Squirt." Then he walked into the air-conditioned terminal. The old man had cleared Indonesian passport control when he'd landed in Jayapura, which, much to the irritation of the Indonesian passport control officer, he kept referring to as Hollandia. He wasn't carrying any luggage other than the backpack. So he walked straight through the terminal building and hailed one of the ubiquitous cabs outside. The ancient Ford Escort trailed blue smoke for 2 blocks to the Baliam Pilamo Hotel. The old man was wealthy, and the Pilamo was the top hotel in the area. The old man dropped his frayed olive-drab backpack in his room and meandered down to the luxurious bar, where he ordered a Pabst Blue Ribbon. The bartender had never heard of that beer, so he suggested a Storm Pilsner. The old man was staring into his beer when a beautiful woman slipped onto the stool next to him. She didn't think the old man was a likely customer, but there were just a few people at that hour, so it couldn't hurt to try. She said lightly, "Buy a girl a drink?" The man turned, studied her. The woman noticed that he was still good-looking, even if he was older than her grandfather. She plumped up the girl speculatively as she leaned toward him. He gave her a sad smile and said meaningfully, "A lot has changed, but some things never do," as he gestured to the bartender to pour the lady whatever she desired. The woman said, "Champagne," which the bartender knew meant ginger ale. He reached for the special iced bottle that was kept under the bar and poured the lady a $20 flute. She raised her glass in a thank you toast to her benefactor and sipped it as she said conversationally, "So, what brings you to our beautiful valley?" He gave her a sardonic smile and said, "I was here once before. Now I'm back to get in touch with a few old friends and fulfill a promise." The woman was intrigued. She said, "When were you here?" The old man laughed sadly and said, "A very long time before you were born." Then he stopped and added, "Do you folks play baseball?" The woman looked puzzled, like she didn't understand the question, and said, "Baseball, that's odd. I know what it is, and some of the Japanese businessmen follow the sport, but the people who live here have never actually played it." The old man smiled ruefully and said, "I didn't think so." He rose, dropped a $100 bill on the bar and said, "I have a long way to walk tomorrow, so I've got to get some sleep. Pay the tab for me, would you, and you can keep the rest." The woman gave him a thank you smile. The tab was $23 even with her $20 glass of ginger ale. The old man made his way to his luxurious hotel room. He carefully undressed and climbed between the 300 thread count sheets, turned off the light, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling. He said, like he was talking to somebody, "I miss you, Squirt." Then he rolled over and went to sleep. The guide was waiting in the lobby after breakfast. He was recognizable by his wide smile and his Baliam Valley Tours t-shirt. The old man muttered under his breath, "The Danny may have changed, but they still have the same smile." The old man was dressed for a trek. He had on an expensive REI Co-op Sahara long-sleeved shirt and heavy cargo pants, along with a pair of substantial hiking boots and an Aussie bush hat. He walked up to the guide, stuck out his hand and said without introduction, "Do you know how to play baseball?" The guide looked confused, and then his eyes lit up with sheer delight as he said, "My grandpop taught me that when I was growing up. He had all the cousins doing it." The old man thought now too much of a coincidence, but he was pleased nonetheless. He said, "I don't want a tour. I just need you to take me to these coordinates," and he unfolded a piece of hotel stationery. The guide entered the coordinates in his Garmin GPS map 66i and whistled. He said, "That's way up in the mountains, 25 miles from here on a gravel road." The old man waited for a click at the end of the statement. But times had indeed changed for the Danny. The guide spoke almost flawless English, if a New Zealander accent can be considered English. The guide said, "I can get you up to Rumah Makan." The old man was much taller than the Danny guide, so he leaned over the guide's shoulder to look at his screen. The location of the drop-off place was familiar. It was the first night's clearing. The guide added, "But to get to that location from there, it's at least a couple of miles straight up through the jungle." The old man said wistfully, I think it's closer to 3. The guide gave him an odd look. The old man smiled. No worries. Just drop me at that spot and I'll give you a call if I need to be picked up. I'll pay you for the whole day. With that, the guide and the old man walked out to a garishly painted, mostly yellow Jeep CJ7 that was parked at the entrance. The old man gently placed his backpack in the rear of the Jeep and hopped into the passenger seat, like a much younger person. Then the two of them drove off through the warren of Wamena streets toward the open countryside. Once they cleared the confusion of the town, the old man said in wonder, "Oh, it's as beautiful as I remember." The guide gave him a sideways glance. This geezer was one very strange dude. They drove along on a narrow asphalt road heading roughly north. They crossed the Barlium River at the Piquet Bridge and continued along the paved portion past cultivated fields, constantly heading toward the highlands at the foot of the mountains. They passed a tourist attraction advertised as a Danny Cave. The guide said, "Want to stop and take a look?" The old man laughed and said, "A kid named Spanky showed it to me, but that was a while back. There wasn't any of the folderol like now." Nearly an hour later, and after numerous twists and turns, the road petered out into a gravel path that had been bulldozed through the primeval jungle. That was when the ride got a lot rougher. But the old man just sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking as if he was going to Sunday church. The guide, who had been carefully watching the GPS, stopped in a little clearing and said, "This is it. I can't take you any further. The coordinates that you are trying to reach are in that direction," and he pointed through the wall of jungle greenery on a roughly northerly bearing. He added, "Are you sure you want to do this?" The old man gave him a beatific smile and said, "Absolutely. I'll give you a ring if I need you." With that, he swung himself out of the Jeep, grabbed his backpack and his own Garmin, and strode directly off into the jungle without giving the guide a backward glance. It was like he was on a mission. The old man climbed upward, following the virtual line of his orienteering software. The jungle was as difficult as ever, and the elevation was getting steeper. The old man would occasionally halt to take a swig from a stainless steel canteen, which he wore on his belt army style. The shooting pains in his left arm were getting worse. Still, he continued to climb. He muttered, "I'm coming, Squirt." He finally reached a big clearing that was marked on the Garmin screen by a red dot. The jungle was alive with noise around him. That was familiar, even after all those years. The floor of the clearing was where considerable excavating had taken place, but that had occurred a long time ago. Now, there were just odd humps and depressions covered by underbrush and vines. New Guinea is littered with wrecks of World War II aircraft. They represent all the participant nations, but the vast majority are Japanese or American. Hence, the wreck of an American C-47 at the edge of the clearing wasn't surprising. The invading jungle had worked to incorporate what was left back into itself, but the aircraft was still clearly recognizable. The wreck was missing both wings and the fuselage was torn open at the back. The tail section was resting a little further down the mountain. The old man walked to the fuselage and peered in through the back. He sighed and then he walked over to the tail part. He stared for a long time at the metal frame of a seat. The canvas was long gone, but the frame remained. He shook his head in disbelief. Then he walked over to an open spot near the remains of the fuselage and carefully surveyed the area. He selected a mound and an accompanying depression. Then he looked around. It was as if he was searching for something associated with that hole, but he found nothing. He shrugged and turned to the task at hand. The team from the American Gravers Registration had painstakingly processed the site during their 1958 visit. The old man was aware that 19 of the bodies they'd recovered were buried at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis. He knew that because he had read their names when he'd visited the gravesite along with his beloved wife. They had also visited Twin Hills Memorial Park in Muncie, Pennsylvania, to pay their respects to a brave little WAC private named Eleanor. The old man and his wife had finished the trip at the military cemetery in the Punch Bowl near Pearl Harbor. Laura Besley was interred there, within sight of the Arizona Memorial, where Frederick, her eternal love, rested. There were tears. The old man sat down. It was not a graceful act. He more or less tumbled to the ground. But that's how 87-year-old men sit, particularly those who have a bad heart. He rummaged in his ancient knapsack and produced a World War II entrenching shovel. He unfolded it and began to dig, much as he had done in the exact same spot 66 years earlier. The arm pains were getting worse. Once he was satisfied with what he'd dug, he lovingly removed the urn from the knapsack and reverentially laid it in the hole. It was her last wish, to reunite with her WAC sisters. His wife had suffered from survivor's guilt her entire life. Now, this final act closed the ledger for her. The old man had fulfilled the promise that he'd made to his beloved wife. Now he lay back slowly and closed his eyes. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do, what his love for his wife had compelled him to do. He was ready to rest. A bit of time passed. The old man's sleep was as still as death. Then a low, sultry voice startled him. "Wake up, cowboy." His eyes flew open, and 24-year-old Maggie Hastings was standing there in all her charismatic glory. She gave him a sexy grin and added, "It's about time too." He said with a huge smile of relief, "You have no idea how much I missed you, Squirt." There were 2 other women standing with Maggie, a puppy dog, cute WAC private, and a beautiful, serenely calm staff sergeant named Laura. The no longer old man thought to himself, "Dang, she was right. Our past and future begin here." Author's note: this is my last story in this vein, so I decided to tie up the lives of the characters who originated in my fictional little Wisconsin town. For those of you who might be interested, in this order: Jed Sharp, Betty Moran and Duke Williams were introduced in The Baltimore Bitch, and Ace McClure and Maggie are from Dulce et Decorum Est. For those of you who are interested in the actual, not fictional, people in this story, the real Corporal Margaret Julia Hastings raised a son and daughter and worked as an admin for the Air Force. She died at age 64 on November 24, 1978, and is buried in Owego. Staff Sergeant Kenneth W. Decker passed away on January 1, 2000 at age 88. He is buried at Cowlitz View Memorial Gardens in Keso, Washington. Lieutenant John S. McCollum, whose role and exploits I shamelessly ripped off for my main character, died in 2001 at age 82. He is buried in Dayton, Ohio. Alexander Howard Ross Cahn's documentary, Rescue from Shangri-La, is viewable on YouTube. You can meet all the real characters there.